Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was making my usual rounds along the cliffs near the lighthouse on Orkney, checking the lamp and the foghorn. It was one of those nights where the wind cut through your coat like a knife, gusting sideways and making the lighthouse sway slightly on its foundation. Rain had passed through earlier, leaving everything slick and glistening under the dim floodlights along the walkway. I was halfway down the cliff path, notebook in hand, jotting down maintenance checks when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a fishing boat, or maybe one of the gulls gliding too low over the water. But the light was wrong. Not the usual lantern glow, not the color of a boat. It was silver, like polished metal reflecting faint moonlight, and it hovered over the waves, not moving side to side, not bobbing with the swell. Just hanging there, steady, like it didn't belong to the world at all. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The wind was brutal, whipping my hair and stinging my face, yet that thing stayed still. I lifted my binoculars from my neck and focused. No ropes, no supports, nothing holding it up. Just a smooth, slightly curved shape, featureless, perfectly balanced above the choppy sea. I blinked, shook my head, and checked behind me. No one else, just the cliffs and the lighthouse. I pulled out my radio, thinking I'd call in, maybe report a boat adrift or some unusual weather equipment gone missing. The thing was still there when I fiddled with the dial. The radio was dead, static, a low hum that wouldn't clear. I cursed under my breath. Batteries were fine. I'd checked them last week. I tried again. Nothing. The humming from the radio seemed to match the rhythm of the waves, but not exactly. There was a subtle delay, an offbeat quality that made me tighten my grip on the device. I watched the silver shape for what felt like several minutes, though my watch said maybe 3. It didn't move closer, didn't rotate, just floated, reflecting the sparse light from the moon and lighthouse. Then, in a fraction of a second, it shot straight up. No acceleration curve, no slowing down. It vanished into the cloud cover overhead like someone had flicked it out of the sky. I blinked hard, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. My radio crackled instantly, a loud burst of static followed by clear, steady reception the moment it disappeared. I dropped the binoculars and grabbed the microphone. "Control, this is Orkney Lighthouse. Do you copy?" The voice came back, perfectly clear, as if nothing had been wrong, though I could still feel the echo of that static in my ears. I tried to explain, but it sounded ridiculous, even to me. I kept glancing at the spot where it had been, scanning the clouds and sea. Nothing. Not a hint, not a ripple, not even a reflection on the water. The waves were just waves again. The wind was still cutting through my coat, the lighthouse lamp still sweeping its beam over the cliffs. It was as if someone had taken a single frame from reality, held it, and then returned everything exactly where it belonged. I walked back to the lighthouse slowly, eyes darting from the cliff edge to the horizon. My boots slipped on wet stone a couple of times, making me jump more than I cared to admit. Inside, I poured a cup of tea, trying to calm my hands. The radio was still buzzing lightly, like it wanted to remind me that something had broken the world for a moment. I sipped slowly, staring out the window at the cliffs. The next day, I checked the logbooks from nearby vessels. Nothing. No reports, no missing equipment, no radar blips. Even the Coast Guard hadn't noticed anything unusual. I went over the events in my head again and again. The object, the hovering, the way the wind seemed to pass right through it, the instantaneous liftoff, and then the radio snapping back to life. Every detail stuck, stubborn and uncomfortable. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a weather balloon, some experimental drone, a trick of light on the waves, but the way it moved, so deliberate, so impossibly smooth, it didn't match anything I'd ever seen. And the moment it disappeared, the radio, that part made no sense at all. Equipment never fixes itself like that. Weeks went by. I kept the binoculars on the shelf by the window, the radio checked and rechecked, but nothing came back. The cliffs stayed quiet. The waves rolled as they always had, gulls circled, and the lighthouse carried on. My days became routine, but at night, When the wind pushed rain against the windows and the lamp swept over the cliffs, I could still see that shape in my mind. I told a few of the other keepers over the radio when they rotated through. Some laughed, some shrugged, one went pale and nodded, said he'd seen something similar years ago but didn't mention it for fear of being labeled crazy. That gave me some comfort. Maybe I wasn't alone. Maybe someone else understood that it wasn't something human, wasn't weather, wasn't an ordinary object. I still go out to the cliffs when the storms hit hard, watching the waves, scanning the clouds, listening to the wind and the low hum in the distance. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I see a flash in the corner of my eye, a brief shimmer over the water. I never get too close, I never call it out loud, but I check the radio, just in case it wants to speak again. The lighthouse keeps turning, the lamp sweeping over the cliffs, and the sea keeps rolling against the rocks. Everything is normal, except for that moment, that single, impossible moment. And the radio, which waits silently, reminding me that whatever I saw didn't belong to the world I understand. I'll be honest, I don't know what it was. I don't have answers. All I know is that it was there and it left in a way that no one could have explained. And for a long time after, I kept checking the horizon, the clouds, the waves, hoping to catch just a glimpse again, half afraid, half needing to see it. The world felt different afterward, quieter somehow, heavier. And I've never felt entirely alone on the cliffs since. I was driving home late that night through the back roads of Dumfries and Galloway. It had been raining on and off, and the sky was clear now, crisp and black, dotted with stars so bright I barely needed my headlights. The road was one of those narrow, twisting lanes that wind between fields and small farms, barely wide enough for two cars. I had the heater on low, a cassette of old tunes playing quietly, and the sense that I could just drive forever. I can't tell you why I looked up. Maybe it was the silence, maybe a need to see something beyond the wet asphalt stretching ahead. But I did. And I noticed the stars. Not just because they were bright, because they weren't all there. A straight line of stars, about 20 or so, blinked out one after the other like someone was erasing them across the sky. It was subtle at first, just a flicker, but then more of the line vanished until it was gone, a dark cut through the constellations. My first thought was clouds. There were none. Nothing moving, nothing drifting, just black. I slowed the car, even though it wasn't fast to begin with. The engine sounded different. Not louder, not strained, just lower in pitch. Like the whole car was underwater or the air had thickened around it. I glanced down at the speedometer. The needle didn't move. I put my foot off the pedal, nothing changed. The engine note was dragging, loud like some kind of distortion in real life. I checked my rearview mirror. The road behind was empty, no other cars, no lights, just dark fields and the faint glow of distant farmhouses. I felt the hair on my arms prickling, that same feeling when you know something is wrong but can't point to exactly what. The line of missing stars stayed for maybe 15 or 20 seconds. Long enough for me to swear I saw movement at the edges of the fields. But when I looked closer, there was nothing, just swaying grass and shadows. Then, abruptly, the line reappeared. The stars blinked back on in the same sequence they'd vanished, like someone had switched the sky back on. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and tried to shake it off. Maybe fatigue, maybe the rain making my brain play tricks, but the engine note was still weird, still low and humming in a way that didn't make sense. I shifted the gear stick, gave the car a gentle rev. The sound snapped back into place, normal pitch, normal rhythm. I shook my head and muttered to myself, I didn't know what the hell had just happened. The rest of the drive home was quiet, though I kept glancing up at the sky, half expecting that line of stars to vanish again. They didn't. The next day, I checked the news. Nothing. No weather oddities, no power outages, no reports of strange phenomena anywhere nearby. I called my brother just to tell someone. He laughed it off, said I'd been driving too long and letting my imagination wander. I didn't argue, but the feeling didn't leave me. That night, and for a few nights after, I stayed in the city. When I drove back down that same road, I kept the headlights on low and the radio playing. Everything was normal. The stars were steady, the engine sounded right. I couldn't make sense of it. Weeks later, I mentioned it to a friend who does amateur astronomy. He said it could have been a satellite or a meteor passing in formation. I nodded, but it didn't fit. Satellites don't make a line of stars blink out like that, and meteors don't drag your car engine down with them. I kept thinking about it for months, about the dark cut across the sky, the odd hum in the car, the way it all snapped back to normal before I could process it fully. It was subtle, but wrong. Like reality hiccuped for a moment, and I happened to be there to notice. I've driven that road plenty of times since, always at night, always alone. I look up at the stars, always scanning, always half expecting that straight line to vanish again. It hasn't, but the memory lingers, soft, persistent, like a weight in the back of my mind. Something was passing overhead that night. I don't know what. I don't even know if it was close or far, or if it even had a shape. Just that the sky was altered for a moment, and the world around me sounded different when it did. I keep thinking about that silence, the low hum, and the stars cutting out in a perfect line. It wasn't fast or loud or violent. It was quiet, unassuming, almost polite, except for the way it made you aware of everything that was wrong. I haven't told anyone else much beyond the few friends who shrug and nod, smiling politely. I don't need explanations. They don't exist for it. But every time I see Dumfries and Galloway's fields from the highway at night, my hand drifts toward the wheel like I'm bracing for it. Even years later, I still check the stars. The line might be gone, but I remember it. The car remembers it. My mind remembers it. And the question of what passed overhead stays with me. I drive home slowly now, letting the headlights trace the road ahead, listening carefully to the engine, eyes moving constantly over the dark fields. Just in case it ever comes back. I hadn't planned to be out on the loch that night. I usually stuck to daylight trips, but I was restless, and the idea of seeing the stars from the water was too good to pass up. My name's Callum Reed. I launched my kayak from a small, nearly abandoned slipway near Luss just after 9, when the last of the daylight had faded, but before the sky turned completely black. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, with a faint mist rolling off the water. You could smell it, like the loch itself was breathing. The first hour was normal. I paddled slowly, enjoying the quiet. Occasionally, I'd hear the slap of water against the hull or a distant call from a bird still stirring. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed it. A flicker, a bright reflection on the water about 100 meters ahead. I froze, thinking maybe it was the lights from a cottage across the loch. But no, it didn't make sense. I knew the shoreline, and there wasn't anything there. I eased my paddle forward, watching the reflection ripple gently on the loch's surface. It was white, sharp, almost like someone had dropped a lantern on the water, but there was no glow, no source above the surface, just the reflection. I paddled closer, keeping my eyes on it. The reflection stayed consistent, moving gently with the small swell, but the source, nothing. Not a light on the shore, not a boat. I stopped again, trying to convince myself it was some trick of the mist or my eyes playing games. I looked around. The loch was empty, just me and the water, the faint mist, and the faint outline of the hills beyond. Then I saw another flicker, this one slightly higher, like a point of light hovering just above the water. My pulse quickened. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was a fishing buoy or one of those navigation markers. I've seen them before, but the color was wrong, and they don't hover in midair. I paddled closer, but the light moved with me, staying at the same distance. The reflection on the water stretched in front of me, perfectly aligned. But when I looked above, the air was empty. I tried calling out, but the sound swallowed itself almost immediately in the mist. Even my own breathing felt loud. It was impossible, but I felt watched. Every time I blinked, the reflection seemed a little closer. I blinked again, and it stayed. My stomach churned. I considered turning back, but curiosity made me pause. I paddled in a semicircle, trying to get a better angle. Every turn, every movement, the reflection responded. If I drifted left, it drifted left. It was like water and light were connected to me, to my kayak. My heart rate was climbing, and I felt this thick tension in the air, like the loch had folded in on itself just enough to hold something in place. After a while, I noticed subtle changes in the loch around me. The small ripples that should have followed my paddle strokes weren't there. The water just accepted my kayak, then smoothed out again. I tried not to panic, but it was unsettling. The reflections remained perfectly sharp, almost as if someone had painted them onto the surface. When I blinked, there was a slight lag in my vision, like the reflection was tracking me in the split second I closed my eyes. I considered getting out and swimming closer, but the mist was thickening and I realized I was alone in the middle of the loch. Even the sound of the water around me seemed muted. Then a faint humming began, soft at first, like distant machinery, but steady. I stopped paddling. The humming got slightly louder, then faded. I looked around. Nothing moved. I paddled toward the reflection again, slowly trying to catch it. When I got closer, the surface of the loch became almost unnaturally still. The reflection sharpened, brighter now, but the source, there was none. I could see every detail in the water, my paddle cutting through, my own shadow stretching toward the reflection, and nothing else. No boat, no light above, no glow on the shore. For a few minutes, I just sat there, frozen. The reflection held itself perfectly, a vertical, elongated shape stretching across the loch. It was mesmerizing, disorienting. I tried blinking, turning, paddling slowly backward. The reflection stayed like it had weight, like it was tethered to the water itself. Then, as I blinked one last time, it disappeared. The water rippled normally, my paddle moved through it with regular resistance, and the faint mist rolled back over the surface. Everything was as it had been, ordinary, except that I knew what I had seen. I stared at the water for a long time, trying to convince myself I imagined it, but the sense of being watched lingered. The silence was too heavy, too deliberate. I turned my kayak back toward the slipway, paddling steadily. The mist closed in around me, hiding the hills, hiding the shoreline. When I finally reached land, my legs felt wobbly. I looked back at the loch, but there was nothing, just black water and faint fog. At home, I tried to describe it to my brother over the phone. He laughed it off. Kayak lights, Callum. Maybe a reflection from a distant cottage. But I knew the water had been empty. I'd seen it. The reflection hadn't been from anywhere above or behind me. It had been there. And when I moved, it moved. I haven't been back out on the loch at night since. Even during the day, it's strange. I watch the water, look for anomalies, and wonder if I'd ever catch it again. The reflection didn't do anything. Not a flash, not a signal, just exist. And that's what makes it feel like it was alive, or at least aware. The loch itself seemed different after that night, like it had been holding something in place and let it go when I blinked. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel the tug in my stomach, the way the air held itself still, the way the reflection followed me. There's nothing to prove it, no photo, no sound recording, just memory, and the knowledge that sometimes the water doesn't belong entirely to me. I was walking home from a late shift at the cafe on Clerk Street. It was a weeknight in October, damp but not raining, and the city was quiet in that weird way it sometimes gets when the buses thin out and the pubs haven't closed yet. My name's Aaron McDonald. I live just off Leith Walk, and on nights like that, I usually cut across the meadows to shave time off my walk. You can see Arthur's Seat from there, a big dark lump against the skyline. I've lived in Edinburgh my whole life, and I've never seen anything strange up there, until that night. I first noticed the light when I was at the corner of Buckledge Place, just as the meadows opened up in front of me. It was a single bright orb above the ridge of Arthur's Seat, not flashing like a plane, not flickering like a drone, just steady. It wasn't a streetlight or a helicopter. It hung higher than the Salisbury Crags, but still low enough that it felt close. The weird thing was how silent everything was. Normally you'd hear sirens, cars, at least some noise from the city. But all I could hear was my own footsteps and the faint hiss of damp leaves under my shoes. I stopped and stared at it for a while. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, white and perfectly round, brighter than the moon, but smaller. After a few seconds, I convinced myself it was some kind of night-climbing lamp or a weather balloon. I started walking again, cutting diagonally across the meadows toward Lauriston Place. When I glanced back, the orb had shifted slightly to the left, not in a drifting way, more like it had repositioned itself. I told myself it was my imagination and picked up the pace. Halfway across, I noticed how empty the park was. No students walking dogs, no cyclists, nothing. The street lamps cast those orange cones of light, and outside them the fog thickened near the grass. The orb was still above Arthur's seat, but it seemed closer, like it was tracking me. I tried to ignore it. My hands were shoved in my coat pockets, and I kept my eyes on the pavement. I only looked up again when I reached the edge of Melville Drive. It was still there. Same brightness, same shape, but I could have sworn it had moved slightly to the right again. I crossed onto Lauriston Place and kept heading north. The city sounds started picking up. Distant cars, a bus braking near Tollcross, but it felt muted, like everything was under a heavy blanket. When I passed the old Royal Infirmary, I glanced back. The orb was no longer over Arthur's seat. It was now above the rooftops near Marchmont, further west, almost directly behind me. My stomach dropped. I walked faster. Every time I turned a corner, the light would vanish, gone completely. But after I walked a block or two, it would reappear, always behind me, always at the same angle. It wasn't high like a plane, and it wasn't bobbing like a drone. It was just there, fixed but following. I tried to be rational. Edinburgh has plenty of weird atmospheric stuff. Maybe it was a reflection from a construction light. But when I stopped outside a closed shop on Lothian Road and looked carefully, there was nothing in the street that could make a reflection like that. I kept moving. My route took me past Prince's Street Gardens. The castle loomed above, dark and solid. When I crossed into the new town, the orb reappeared again, now lower, almost at rooftop height. I could see its glow reflecting faintly in the upper windows of some Georgian flats. It was smaller than before, but still too bright to be anything normal. I ducked into a close, waited a minute, and peered out. Nothing, just the normal city night. I stepped back onto the pavement and started walking again. Within 2 minutes, there it was. Above me now, like it had hopped across the sky. By the time I reached York Place, I was genuinely scared. My phone had full bars, but my GPS was frozen. The blue dot wouldn't move even though I was walking. I tried rushing it, but the map just stuck. The street felt deserted despite the hour not being that late. Even the trams were quiet. I decided to call my flatmate, Anna. The call wouldn't go through. No error message, just silence, like the line was open, but no one on the other end. I hung up and tried again. This time it rang once and then cut off. I crossed onto Broughton Street, nearly home now. The orb was back behind me, a bit higher again. I didn't dare stop to look at it directly, so I caught glimpses in shop windows, its white glow hanging there, not reflected from anything, just present. Every time I blinked, it felt like it shifted a fraction. Not toward me, but adjusting. When I reached my building on Leith Walk, I shoved the key in the door, stepped inside, and slammed it shut. My heart was pounding. I went straight to my window, pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just the usual orange streetlight glow and a few drunken students walking past. The sky was blank. My GPS updated suddenly, showing my exact location. My phone calls worked again. Everything normal. I stayed at the window for a long time. I wanted to see it again, to prove to myself it wasn't just exhaustion or a trick of the light. But there was nothing out there. No orb, no silence, no weird stillness. Just a regular damp Edinburgh night. Eventually I sat down, still wearing my coat, and stared at my hands for a while. My palms smelled faintly of metal, like coins. The next morning I walked the same route to work in daylight. People everywhere, cars, noise, the whole city awake. I kept looking up at Arthur's seat, but the sky was clear. No balloons, no helicopters, no bright orbs. At lunch, I asked a few coworkers if they'd seen anything strange last night. Nobody had. One of them joked about UFOs. I laughed it off. I don't walk across the meadows at night anymore. I stick to the busier streets, even if it takes longer. Sometimes when I'm heading home and I glance toward the skyline, I think I see something. A small white glow above the crags, but when I blink, it's gone. I haven't told Anna the full story. I'm not sure how to explain it without sounding crazy, but I know what I saw, and I know how it felt. Like something was moving with me across the city, just out of reach, silent and steady, watching until I got home. I'd gone out for a walk because I couldn't sleep. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and the tide was low on the east side of Sanday. My aunt's cottage was about a mile inland, but I'd been staying there for a few days, helping her clear out some old furniture, and I'd started walking at night just to get away from the smell of dust and varnish. It was quiet, so quiet that even the waves sounded muted. The sand felt cold and damp through my trainers, and the sky was this heavy gray, with low clouds blotting out the stars. My name's Ela Grant. I grew up in Sterling, but I've spent enough summers on Orkney to know its moods. That night felt wrong as soon as I stepped onto the beach. There was no wind, which is rare there, and the sea was glassy, even though it should have been choppy. I walked along the waterline with my hands in my jacket pockets, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I first noticed the light about 15 minutes into the walk. It was out on the water, maybe a couple hundred meters offshore. At first, I thought it was a trawler, but it wasn't horizontal. It was vertical, a single white beam rising straight from the water like someone had lowered a searchlight under the waves. It was perfectly still, perfectly straight, and way too bright to be anything I'd seen before. No flicker like a torch, and no glow like a buoy, just a column of light, dead white. I stopped walking. The beam didn't waver. My first instinct was to get my phone out and take a photo, but the battery had been low when I left and had shut itself off in the cold. I stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. No sound, no movement, just light. I squinted, thinking maybe it was a trick of the clouds or a reflection from something inland, but there was nothing behind me. The cottages were dark. The road was empty. I blinked, and for a split second, the beam like it had shifted, just slightly, like it had angled toward me. I blinked again, and it was back where it had been. It made my stomach drop. It felt like when someone's looking at you across a room and you can't prove it, but you're sure. Every time I blinked, the beam seemed a little closer, like it was edging toward the shore, but in a way I couldn't catch in motion. It never moved while my eyes were open. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just tired. I forced myself to keep walking along the beach, but I kept glancing back. The beam stayed in my peripheral vision, and it seemed sharper every time. I could see its reflection on the water now, a perfect mirrored line. No ripples, no disturbance in the sea around it, just a glowing knife stuck upright in the dark. I stopped again and cupped my hands around my mouth. "Hello?" My voice sounded small. Nothing answered, not even the usual echo off the cliffs. I swallowed and started backing away toward the dunes. When I blinked, the beam had moved again, closer, maybe 50 meters now. It wasn't drifting, it was just skipping distance when I wasn't looking. I turned and walked faster. My heart was hammering, but I tried to stay calm. I kept telling myself it was a boat light, some weird reflection, anything normal. When I reached the dune path, I risked one last glance. The beam was right at the shoreline now. It hadn't made a sound, but the air felt different, like the heaviness before a thunderstorm. The sand under my feet vibrated faintly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel through my shoes. I stumbled on the path and had to grab a tuft of grass to steady myself. I squeezed my eyes shut, took a breath, and opened them again. The beam was gone. The beach was empty. The water was black and flat. My ears were ringing, like after a loud noise, though I hadn't heard one. I didn't run, but I walked as fast as I could back toward the cottage. My phone was still dead, and there wasn't another soul around. When I reached the back door, my aunt's dog, Tansy, was pacing and whining like she'd been hearing something outside. She doesn't usually react to much. I locked the door and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the floor, trying to decide if I'd really seen it. In the morning, I went back down to the same spot. The tide had come in, and the sand was smooth, but there was a strange line of dry sand running straight down from the dunes to the water, like something had left a mark without touching it. No footprints, no driftwood, just that line. The sea was normal again, wind picking up, gulls screaming, everything looked ordinary. I haven't told many people about it because I don't have anything to show. I know what I saw, though. It wasn't like any lighthouse or boat or light I've ever seen. The way it seemed to move when I blinked, that's the part I keep replaying. Like it was aware of me noticing, like it didn't want to be caught in the act. Even now, thinking about it, I can feel that same pressure in the air. The way the dog was restless, the silence on the beach. No sound but my own breathing, and that beam, impossibly white, impossibly straight, lifting out of the sea. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. My name's Callum Fraser, and I've been hiking and camping all over Scotland, but the Isle of Skye was a first. Claire, my mate from Edinburgh, came along mostly because she wanted a break from work, and we figured a weekend on the Cuillin would be a good mix of exercise and scenery. We arrived late afternoon, just enough time to set up a small tent in a clearing tucked beneath a ridge. The sky was clouding over, the kind that makes everything smell wet and earthy, the kind that smells like the mountains themselves. By the time we had the tent set up, the sun had dipped behind the peaks, leaving a heavy purplish dusk. The wind had died down, which was unusual for that area, and there was this thick quiet that made the place feel almost paused. We had dinner of canned beans and bread, just enough to keep us warm, and then we sat outside with a couple of beers, watching the last light fade from the mountain ridges. I can be very still when I'm out in the wild, listening and looking, and something about that evening just made me want to stay still for longer. It started around 10:30. Claire had gone into the tent for a nap, and I was outside, leaning on my pack, staring up at the dark silhouette of the peaks. Then I noticed it. A faint red dot, like a tiny distant lantern, floating above the ridgeline. My first thought was someone else's headlamp, maybe another camper, but there shouldn't have been anyone up there, at least according to the map and the way the trails looped. And then another dot appeared, and another. They weren't moving in a straight line or along a path. They were weaving, looping, dipping, almost dancing across the peaks. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. I fumbled for my camera, but the moment I pointed it, the lights blinked out, gone, leaving only the black of the mountains against the night sky. I muttered to myself, thinking maybe it was a trick of my eyes, but then a low hum rose from somewhere below the ridge. Not like wind or distant traffic, something more mechanical, more constant, but soft. I called Claire out. She zipped up the tent and came, still rubbing her eyes. I pointed toward the peaks, and we watched in silence. Slowly, the lights returned. They appeared one by one, tracing impossible patterns, angles and arcs that no drone, no aircraft I knew of could perform, and the hum persisted, almost vibrating in the air around us. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. I tried shining my torch at the lights, sweeping across the ridge. The second the beam hit them, they vanished. Complete blackness. I lowered the torch, and a few seconds later, they were back, flicking along a different path. Claire didn't speak at first, just stared, eyes wide, and then whispered, "Callum, what is that?" I didn't have an answer. I wanted to say, probably someone messing about, but the movement was wrong for human hands. The timing, the way they blinked on and off, the low hum, it all made my stomach tighten. And then, for maybe 10 minutes, the lights performed a sort of choreography above us, then vanished in an instant. The hum lingered a little longer, then went too. We tried talking, trying to rationalize it. We speculated maybe a weather balloon, maybe reflections, maybe some mountain animals with bioluminescence, but none of it made sense. The hum wasn't natural, the patterns weren't natural, and nothing we could think of explained how they could disappear the instant you tried to document them. I remember checking my watch around that time. It was blinking, slow, like it had lost power for a fraction of a second, then caught up again. Not a big deal on its own, but combined with the lights and hum, it added to the unease. The wind shifted, rustling the low heather, and suddenly the air felt thicker. I couldn't hear the normal night insects. Claire noticed too. "It's like the moor's holding its breath," she said, voice tight. Eventually, the lights were gone, and the hum dissipated completely. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting just inside the tent flap, listening to the normal sounds finally return. We didn't sleep well, but we were too alert to doze. Every so often, we would glance at the peaks, but the sky stayed black and ordinary, stars scattered as they should be. Morning came with fog creeping up the slopes. We packed quickly, our conversation minimal. Neither of us wanted to talk about it much, because saying it aloud made it feel like maybe we'd imagined it, though neither of us believed that fully. On the drive back to Portree, I kept checking the rear view and side mirrors, half expecting to catch a glimpse of red again, but nothing appeared. The rest of the day felt off. Time seemed to stretch in strange ways. My watch and Claire's phone were fine, but for that night, the memory of the impossible patterning of lights and the low humming stayed with me like a shadow. I've gone back to Sky a few times since then, but I've never seen anything remotely like it again. And when I tell people, they either smile politely or shrug. But that night, above the Kulin, something was there that wasn't supposed to be. The lights, the hum, the way everything froze in silence around us. It wasn't anything I can explain, and I don't think I ever will. I'd been up since before 5, the kind of early Scottish morning where the mist rolls down the glens like a living thing. My name's Ewan MacLeod, and I usually hike the Coe in summer when the trails are clear, the crags visible, and the air sharp but friendly. That morning, though, the sky was heavy with gray clouds, the kind that make the world seem smaller and more distant. My friend Isla and I had started early, thinking we'd catch the sunrise from Buachali Etive Moor, but by the time we'd rounded the first bend past the River Coe, the fog had dropped hard, swallowing the trail and everything beyond 20 feet. It's funny how quickly sound changes in fog. The river's normal roar seemed muffled, the birds either gone or silent. I could hear Isla breathing, see the puff of her breath in front of me, but otherwise it was just a wall of gray. I tried to keep my compass in mind, the map, the cairns along the path, but visibility was near zero. At some point we realized we'd passed a junction, but we had no idea which path we'd taken. I suggested we pause, sit down for a moment, just to get our bearings. Leela nodded, and we settled on a flat rock, the mist curling around us like it was alive. And then I noticed movement. At first it was subtle, shapes flitting just at the edge of perception. Pale, almost the same color as the fog, small, moving with a kind of deliberate curiosity. I rubbed my eyes, blinked, and the shapes were still there, drifting between boulders around trees, following no trail I could see. They were too low to be birds, too quick for deer. Ela saw them too, because she whispered, "Ewan, do you see that?" I nodded, though I couldn't explain it. The figures didn't make noise. No rustling, no footsteps, nothing. We got up, tried to walk toward the next cairn we thought we recognized, but every time we turned a corner, more of them appeared, just out of reach of the fog. They weren't threatening, but there was this insistence to their presence. I don't know how else to describe it, like they were aware of us, tracking, waiting. I kept calling out, "Hello?" but the sound seemed to vanish instantly, swallowed by the mist. No echo, no response, just silence. I tried to stay rational. "It's probably someone else lost," I told Isla. "Tourists, maybe. They're bundled up in white jackets or something." But that didn't make sense. I strained my eyes, squinting through the fog, and the shapes weren't wearing jackets. They didn't have features, clothing, or any detail at all. Just small, pale outlines that moved like shadows in water. We took a few steps toward them, hoping to see something familiar, and then they shifted, always keeping distance, moving in ways that didn't follow natural paths. They slipped behind rocks, through trees, and when we blinked or looked away for a second, they were gone. The trail itself began to betray us. Stones that were there moments ago had disappeared, roots appeared where none should be, and the ground beneath our feet felt wrong. Not unstable, but like the landscape itself had shifted just enough to confuse us. I glanced at my watch. It was 6:17, but somehow that felt off. The fog was dense and light barely penetrated it, though the sun should have been higher by then. Isla froze suddenly, pointing. "There." I looked in the direction she was pointing, and a figure or several stood just beyond a boulder. They were pale, featureless, no taller than a child, and they just watched. I could see their shape through the mist, but when I tried to take a step closer, they were gone. No footprints, no scuffing, no sign they'd been there at all. We both exhaled heavily. I don't think either of us had spoken since the shapes appeared. We decided to head back the way we thought we'd come. Every time we turned, the figures reappeared in our peripheral vision. Sometimes several would pass by, silent and slow, vanishing when we tried to look directly at them. And every so often, the fog thickened even more suddenly, and we had to wait, holding hands, moving cautiously until it thinned again. I began to notice the air itself was different. The dampness seemed heavier, clinging to our clothes, and there was a faint smell I couldn't place. Not wet earth or river or moss, but chemical, metallic, faint. Isla noticed it too. She wrinkled her nose and whispered something about ozone, but I knew she hadn't smelled it before. After what felt like hours, though was probably only half an hour, the fog began to lift slightly. The pale figures, as if aware of the change, all vanished at once. No shapes in the distance, no movement, nothing. Just normal mist rolling down the glen. We reached a cairn we recognized, and the sun was peeking weakly over the ridge. Birds called tentatively from the trees. The river's roar was normal again. I tried to convince Isla it had been a trick of the light, our exhaustion, maybe even a hallucination brought on by the damp cold. She shook her head. "No," she said. "I saw them too. And you saw how they moved. You can't just make that up." I nodded, though I had no explanation. We didn't talk much the rest of the way down. The world had returned to normal, the usual sights, smells, and sounds of Glen Coe, but something in it felt different. The early morning calm wasn't just quiet, it was expectant, like the place had noticed us. When we got back to the car, I checked my watch again. Time had passed normally, but it felt stretched somehow. That night, I tried to sketch what we'd seen. Pale figures shifting through fog, moving in ways that weren't natural. I've kept those sketches, though I've shown them to no one. People would think we were joking or insane. The strange part is, the memory isn't fading. I can close my eyes and see them, drifting silently, just out of reach, with the fog curling around them. I haven't hiked in Glencoe early in the fog since. Not that I don't want to. The glen's beautiful, but every time the mist rolls in, I think of those figures. Small, pale, silent, always moving, watching. And I can't shake the feeling that the glen itself remembers too. I was out on Loch Ness later than usual that night, the kind of evening where the fog rolls in off the water and drapes over the hills like wet cloth. I'd been fishing near the old pier just north of Invermoriston, mostly keeping the boat steady and letting the line drift. My only company was the occasional gull and the low, steady splash of my oars. Around 10, I noticed it. A glow, faint at first, hovering over the far end of the loch, soft, pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The light hadn't shifted, not like a boat, not like the reflection of a distant village. It just hovered above the water, and the surface directly beneath it rippled in a way that didn't match the wind or the current. Almost as if the water itself was reacting to something unseen. I called out, thinking maybe someone was messing about with lanterns or one of the tourist boats. No response. My dog, Fergus, curled up at the bow, like ears flicking nervously, staring in the same direction. The light pulsed again, a slow inhale-exhale kind of rhythm, and I noticed the ripples weren't just beneath it. They were moving outward in perfect concentric circles, quiet, precise. I rowed closer. My oars made a soft splash, but the water immediately smoothed over behind me as though it hadn't even been touched. My heart picked up. I'd been on the loch hundreds of nights, alone, in fog, in calm, in storms, but I'd never seen anything behave like this. "Hello?" I tried again, my voice sounding small and hollow over the water. Nothing, just the gentle pulse of light, the water, and the occasional cry of a bird somewhere far off. I eased closer, angling the boat so I could get a better look. The light was dimmer now, but more defined, a rounded, soft-edged oval hovering maybe 20 feet above the water. It didn't shine like a lamp, didn't reflect anything. It just glowed from within. I grabbed my camera from the seat beside me, fumbling with the lens. In the viewfinder, it looked like nothing. The light wasn't registering properly, almost transparent, like my camera refused to capture it. I tried again, different settings, even the phone's night mode. Nothing. Just the dark water and the faint outlines of distant hills. My pulse hit my throat. Fergus whimpered, low and hesitant, and I caught myself speaking aloud, though I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear an answer. "What are you?" My own voice sounded absurd, ridiculous even, but I felt compelled to ask. I rowed closer still, careful, slow, the light pulsing gently. And then, just as I got within maybe 50 feet, the glow flickered once and vanished. No fading, no upward movement, no drift, just gone. The water beneath it went flat immediately, perfectly calm. No ripples, no trace of disturbance, nothing to suggest it had been there. I sat in the boat, hands frozen on the oars, listening to nothing but the loch. My heart was still thumping, and Fergus was trembling. I tried to shake it off, told myself I must have imagined it. Reflections, a trick of the fog, phosphorescence in the water. but I'd rowed closer. I'd seen it with my eyes. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't fireflies, it wasn't anything natural I know of. I checked my watch. 15 minutes had passed, though it felt like seconds. Everything seemed slightly off. The fog was thicker now, but it wasn't raining. The wind had died down completely, but the air still felt heavy. I rowed back slowly, not wanting to move too quickly, half expecting the light to reappear, half afraid it would. By the time I reached the pier, I was drenched with sweat under my coat, though the temperature hadn't changed. I tied the boat off, looked back over the lock. Nothing. Just black water stretching toward hills disappearing into fog. I felt exposed, tiny, like I'd trespassed somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I called the local ranger station from the pier, trying to report a light, something unusual. They asked if I was sure it wasn't a buoy, a boat, or one of the tourist operations still running at night. I said yes, absolutely. It wasn't that. They noted it politely, then told me to be careful. I didn't push further. Later, back home, I sat with a cup of tea, staring out my kitchen window toward the loch. The fog had cleared a bit, stars glinting faintly. Fergus curled at my feet, still jittery. I tried to think rationally, retrace the night in my head. Every detail, the pulsing, the ripples, the way it vanished, the way my camera couldn't record it. All of it felt impossible. I couldn't get it off my mind, kept imagining the glow returning, hovering above the water, calm and silent, the loch reacting beneath it as though it had had weight or influence over the world. I started sleeping with the window cracked, just in case, listening to the faint lapping of water against the shore, expecting something. I wasn't sure what. The next day, I went back to the pier, hoping for some rational sign, a log from another fisherman, a reflection from a passing boat. Nothing. The loch was normal, the water moving naturally, the gulls calling over the shore. I scanned the horizon over and over, but the pulse never came back. I've been out a few times since, nights and mornings, checking the loch when it's calm, foggy, quiet, no lights, no ripples, nothing unnatural. And yet, every time I see the water stilling perfectly, I feel the memory of that glow, hovering silently, judging me from the far end. I can't explain it. Nothing I know accounts for it. I rowed closer. I saw it. It vanished. The loch returned to normal, but I didn't. And some nights, I swear, I feel a weight, just above the water, pulsing softly, reminding me that whatever it was might still be out there, watching. I was up before the sun, like I always am. Name's Ewan McLeod, and I've been farming a small patch outside Aberdeen for most of my life. Early mornings aren't unusual for me, but that one was different. It was just starting to get light, pale blue streaks cutting through low clouds, and the mist was still heavy over the barley fields. The air had that damp iron smell you get near the river in spring. I just finished filling the water troughs when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, a reflection off some old tin in the barn maybe. But no, it wasn't on the ground. There it was, hovering maybe 50 feet above the field near the north fence, a perfect disc, metallic, reflecting the dim light in a dull gray-white shimmer. It didn't move like a plane or a drone. It just hung there, silent and somehow solid. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. I've seen plenty of strange things in the sky, geese in weird formations, the odd weather balloon. But this was different. It didn't drift or sway. It just stayed in one spot, not affected by the morning wind. I grabbed my binoculars, thinking maybe it was some experimental aircraft, but there was nothing else around it. No wings, no markings, no tail, no noise. I reached for my phone to call my neighbor, old Colin, because I figured, well, I'd seen enough weird things in my life to know that people aren't supposed to see something like this alone. While I was dialing, I turned back to the field, and it was gone. The disc had just disappeared. Panic didn't hit me immediately, just this heavy, almost physical confusion. I walked toward the field, thinking maybe it had landed or that just misjudged it. The barley looked normal, swaying with the breeze, until I stepped closer. There was a circle where the grass was flattened, pressed down in a near-perfect disc. It wasn't torn or broken, just pressed. Smooth, like someone had laid down and rolled out over it. I crouched, running my fingers over the stalks. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest it was anything terrestrial. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was frost settling oddly, but the circle was too clean, too precise. I called Colin again, voice shaking a little. He answered on the second ring. Colin, you awake? Ewan? It's early. What's up? You've got to come see this field. Now, north end by the fence. There was a pause, then a grumble. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't touch anything. I hung up and waited, pacing along the edge of the field. Every so often I'd glance up, half expecting the disc to return, but the sky was empty, just fog and streaks of early light. Colin arrived, slow, his old pickup crunching over the frost-hardened ground. He climbed down, scratched his head, and followed me to the circle. He looked at it, blinked, and muttered, "Well, I'll be." "Seen anything like this before?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not outside stories my granddad told, crop circles, bits of metal in the sky, but nothing real." We stood there for a few minutes, silent, just watching the morning light make the dew on the flattened barley sparkle. I kept glancing toward the horizon, half expecting the disk to reappear. Nothing. "What's odd," Colin said finally, "is that the frost on the edges is untouched. Only the circle's smooth, like someone pressed it deliberately. No other marks." I nodded. My mind kept flipping through possibilities. Helicopters, small aircraft, some farmer messing about. But the silence, the perfect shape, the way it just vanished before I could get a proper look, none of it added up. By the time we'd measured it roughly, taken a few photos with my phone, and compared notes, the sun had risen fully. The mist was lifting, revealing the rest of the field and the low hills beyond. The disk was nowhere. No sound. No trace in the sky. We tried rationalizing it as much as we could while walking back to the farmhouse. Maybe it was an experimental drone from the university, some kind of weather monitoring thing. But drones don't hover so large, so solid, with no noise. And the flattened circle, nothing man-made would do that so cleanly without leaving evidence. I kept looking at the photos on my phone. The circle was visible, slightly brighter where the sun hit the frost differently. Nothing else. I showed them to Colin, who just shook his head. "I can't explain that, Ewan. Don't think anyone else will either." For the next few days, I couldn't stop checking the field. The circle stayed exactly as it was, the barley slowly rising back up, but still showing the imprint if you looked close. No more lights in the sky, no more hovering discs. It was as if it had been a momentary anomaly, gone as quickly as it appeared. I mentioned it to a few other farmers in the area over the week. Most laughed it off. One old bloke swore he'd seen similar in the 60s near Aberdeen. None could offer any explanation. I keep the photos on my phone. Sometimes I look at them and wonder if I imagine the disc itself, even though the flattened circle is real, undeniable. I've gone back to that part of the field many times. Nothing else happens, but every time I do, I feel that same quiet, that pause in the morning where the air feels like it's holding its breath. It wasn't terrifying, not in the traditional sense, just wrong, out of place. The kind of wrong that leaves your mind running through explanations and coming up empty. I farmed this land for decades, and I've seen all sorts of things. Fog that rolls in like it's alive, strange cloud formations, flocks behaving oddly, but nothing like that morning. I can't explain it. I don't know if anyone can. And yet, I'll keep an eye on that sky and that field every morning I can, because if it ever comes back, I want to see it with my own eyes again. I first heard the hum late one night in February. The Isle of Mull is quiet in winter, especially where my cottage sits above the cliffs near Carseg. I'd been living there for a few years, working part-time at the ferry terminal and doing odd carpentry jobs. That night, I'd just finished sanding a door and stepped outside to shake the dust off my jumper. The air was cold, the kind that makes your breath hang for a moment before drifting off. I noticed the hum right away. It was low, steady, like the engine of a distant ship, but the sea below was calm and empty. At first, I thought it was the wind making a trick through the rocks. Mull can be strange that way, sounds bouncing around the cliffs, but there was no wind, just stillness and that hum soft enough you could almost ignore it. But once you caught it, you couldn't stop listening. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It felt like it was everywhere at once, seeping through the ground. The next morning at the cafe in Craigner, I asked Ewan, who runs the place, if he'd noticed it. He looked at me for a second and said, "That noise by Carseg?" Like it wasn't news to him. He told me a few people had mentioned it, fishermen mostly, and a woman who rents the holiday cottage near mine. But he didn't make a big deal of it. Weird acoustics along the cliffs, he said. Nothing new. I let it go for a week. The hum wasn't there every night, but when it came back, it would stick around for hours, usually after dark. Sometimes it would rise a little, like a pitch shift, then dip back down. It wasn't loud, but it made my windows vibrate slightly. More than once, I woke up in the small hours thinking my phone was buzzing on the nightstand, only to realize it was that low sound again. One night in early March, my neighbor Fiona stopped by. She's older, lives farther inland, but walks her dog along the cliffs most evenings. She asked me if I'd been hearing it too. I told her I had, and she said she'd tried to follow it, but it didn't get louder or quieter no matter where she stood. It's like it's under the earth, she said, rubbing her arms, or under the water. We both went outside then, around 9. The sky was clear and the moon bright enough to see the path down to the edge. The hum was there again, steady, deeper than before. Fiona's dog whined and wouldn't go near the cliff. I shone my torch around, but saw nothing unusual, just the jagged rocks, the heather bending slightly in the breeze, and the black stretch of water below. A few days later, I decided to check the area in daylight. There's a rough path that runs down near the rock formations called the Karseg Arches. I took my camera, thinking maybe I'd catch something, but the day was normal. Gulls, a few seals on the rocks, and no hum at all. The strangeness really started 2 weeks after that. It was a calm evening, the tide low, and the hum louder than I'd ever heard it. Not enough to hurt, but enough to feel in my ribs. I stepped outside in a faint glow along the cliff edge about 200 meters away. It wasn't like a torch or a car headlight. It was a smooth, pale strip of light, almost level with the top of the rock, and it didn't flicker. I walked toward it slowly. My boots crunched on the gravel, and as I got closer, the glow seemed to draw back like it was sliding away. But when I stopped, it stopped too. The hum was stronger there. I crouched down and ran my hand over the ground, expecting to feel vibration, but it was cold and still. Then, without any noise or movement, the glow went out, just black rock again. The hum faded a few seconds later, like someone turning down a volume knob. I went back to the cottage, a bit shaken. I didn't tell anyone that time. But the next day at the ferry terminal, a man named Callum, who runs one of the tour boats, asked me if I'd been out late the night before. I said yes, and he told me he'd been bringing his boat in around 10 when he saw a dark shape resting on the cliff near Karseg. He couldn't make it out clearly, but said it looked like a black craft sitting on the rocks. He thought it was a wreck, or maybe some kind of Navy thing, until it rose straight up, slow and silent, and disappeared into the clouds. He laughed after he said it, like he knew how it sounded, but he wasn't joking. Never seen anything like it, he said. No lights, no noise, just gone. That night, the hum came back, even stronger. I sat inside with the lights off, looking out the window toward the cliff. Around midnight, I saw a flash, just a quick pulse of white. Not lightning, not a car. Then silence. The hum stopped completely after that. For several nights, there was nothing. No hum, no lights. Then Fiona knocked on my door one morning. She said she'd been walking at dawn and thought she saw small marks on the rock near where we'd been standing that night. A series of smooth depressions in a circle, like something heavy had been set down there. By the time we went back to look later, the tide had come in and washed over the spot. Since then, the hum has returned on and off, never as strong as before. People still talk about it quietly. Someone at the shop, a guy fixing his car on the road, but nobody makes a big thing of it. I haven't seen the glow again, and I've never heard Callum mention that craft a second time. I still live in the cottage. Most nights are normal, but when the hum starts up, even faintly, I notice the dog on the hill across from me bark for a few seconds, then go silent. The gulls drift off, and the seals slip into the water. The whole area feels like it's holding its breath. I'll step outside sometimes, stand by the edge, and listen. It's always the same, low, steady, with no clear source. Some nights it seems farther away, other nights like it's right under my feet. I've tried recording it on my phone, but the sound never comes through. Just wind. I haven't gone back to the exact spot where the glow appeared. I could, but I don't. When the hum starts, I stay inside, lights off, and wait for it to fade. Eventually, it always does. Then the seals return, the dog barks again, and the sea sounds like the sea. I'd driven up to Loch Tai in early September, wanting a quiet weekend away from everything. I've camped around Scotland before, but this part of the Highlands felt different, like the hills pressed closer to the water than anywhere else I'd been. I set up my tent on a small spit of land, the loch stretching out in front of me, the trees behind. There wasn't a soul around, just the occasional gull and the wind moving the reeds along the edge. It was getting dark, and the sky was turning that deep blue you only get in the Highlands when I decided to take the kayak out for a bit. The water was smooth, almost unnaturally still, the kind of night where you could see the reflection of the hills perfectly. I paddled slowly, just enjoying the quiet. About 20 minutes out from shore, I noticed something. Small ripples, too regular to be random, skimming across the water's surface a few meters ahead. I assumed it was a fish, maybe a big one, or a log moving with the current. But as I got closer, I realized there was nothing visible in the water. The ripples moved fast, almost gliding, and then stopped as abruptly as they started. I shrugged it off, figuring my eyes were playing tricks on me in the fading light, and turned back toward the tent. That's when I saw it. A glimmer on the water, maybe a meter above the surface, like a reflection of the moon but brighter, moving along with no wake, no disturbance in the water at all. It was perfectly horizontal, just sliding over the loch, and as I blinked it seemed to vanish, only to reappear a few meters further along. I froze in the kayak, unsure if I was imagining it. I reached for my phone to check the GPS, hoping that would help me make sense of it, and noticed the screen flicker. The compass app, which I always keep on when kayaking, started spinning wildly. I leaned over to check, thinking maybe it was low battery or interference, but the spinning continued for several minutes. The glimmer moved again, slow, almost lazily, until it disappeared behind the curve of the loch. I paddled to the shoreline as fast as I could, my hands shaking more from adrenaline than the cold. By the time I got back to the tent, the loch was calm again, the sky dark, everything as if nothing had happened. I sat on a rock and stared out across the water, but there was nothing, no glimmer, no movement, no disturbance. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just reflections, maybe a trick of the low moonlight on the mist rising from the water. I had dinner, brewed some tea, and eventually crawled into the tent, the events sticking in the back of my mind. Morning came, fog low over the loch. I packed up, still uneasy. I walked along the shoreline to check where I'd launched the kayak and expected to see something. A mark in the water, broken reeds, disturbed mud. But there was nothing. The shoreline looked untouched, as if I'd never been there. Not a single sign that anything had moved over the water. I pulled out my compass again, trying to orient myself, and it spun. Slowly at first, then faster. I checked multiple times, moving along the shore, and every compass I had on me, including the watch, did the same thing for nearly 2 hours. My sense of direction was completely unreliable. The sun came out eventually, and the compasses started to behave normally again, but the memory of the spinning remained in my mind. I paddled the kayak back out briefly just to see if the glimmer would appear again, but the loch was just loch. Calm, still, reflecting the sky and the hills. I couldn't see a thing. No movement, no disturbance, no object skimming the water. I stayed on the shore the rest of the morning, moving slowly, listening to the gulls, but the sense of being watched stayed with me. Driving home, I noticed other small things I hadn't before. The dashboard compass on my car flickered once, the radio crackled faintly, nothing major but enough to make me uneasy. Every time I passed a body of water after that weekend, I found myself checking the surface, half expecting to see a glimmer moving without a wake. I've gone back to Loch Tai several times since during the day with friends, and nothing happens. The water behaves like water, the shoreline like any other, the compasses work normally. But that night, in that small stretch of loch under the low September moon, everything acted as if the laws I trusted weren't quite real. I tell people, and they usually shrug it off. Moonlight, reflections, wind. But I know what I saw. And I know what I felt, the stillness, the unnatural glide over the water, the compasses spinning. Something moved there, something I can't explain, and for those few minutes, it was the only thing that existed on that loch. I don't go kayaking at night alone anymore, not on Loch Tay, not anywhere. And sometimes when I see the calm of a loch at dusk, I swear I catch a glimmer moving across the surface, always just beyond reach, leaving the water perfectly still behind it. I was heading back from work around 10 that night, late October, the wind off the Atlantic already biting through my jacket. The Outer Hebrides can be like that. One minute the sky's clear, the next it's misty and full of gusts. I just finished my shift at the ferry office in Stornoway and was driving home toward Callanish, the road barely more than a ribbon cutting through dunes and crofts. The first thing I noticed was the sound, a low, steady pulse, almost like a drumbeat, but too regular to be a sea swell or wind through the tall grasses. It thumped beneath the tires and hummed in my chest when I rolled the windows down. I slowed to a crawl, expecting the noise to fade as I moved, but it didn't. In fact, it seemed to follow me along the stretch of road, coming from the dunes to my left. I pulled over onto the shoulder, fog swirling in from the sea, visibility dropping to maybe 10 meters. The pulse was clearer now, resonating across the sand. My first thought was someone had set up some sort of generator or party light in the dunes, but I couldn't see anything. No glow, no headlights, no movement. Just the sound, pulsing steady and insistent. I grabbed my torch and started walking into the dunes, boots sinking into wet sand, the smell of salt and seaweed thick in the air. The pulse seemed to lead me, drawing me further along the ridge. I kept calling out, expecting maybe some local kids, but the voice of the wind swallowed my words. Then I noticed the sand. In the weak beam of my torch, the surface seemed patterned. Concentric circles, each about a meter across, pressed down like something heavy had been balanced there. But there were no footprints, no tracks. The sand hadn't been disturbed in any natural way I could tell. My stomach tightened. The pulse didn't come from any single spot. It seemed to radiate outward, coming from somewhere between the dunes and the open beach. But no matter how far I walked or turned, I couldn't pinpoint a source. I tried to radio my sister on my phone. She lives just a mile down the coast. No signal. Even in the daytime, the dunes make coverage patchy. But tonight, it was dead. I kept walking, circling the sand patterns, torchlight catching reflections off small shells and pebbles. The pulse grew slightly louder as I moved closer to the center of the pattern, though the sand itself remained flat and undisturbed. After maybe 10 minutes of wandering, I stopped. The pulse didn't change. It was hypnotic, almost. My head started to ache a little from trying to figure out what I was hearing. I crouched down to examine the circles, trying to find a sign of machinery, a buried generator, anything. Nothing. The sand was untouched. Even the grass growing near the edge of the circle hadn't bent. Then it shifted. Not in location exactly, but the rhythm altered, subtle, like a deep note skipping. My torch flickered for a moment, a loose battery maybe, though I'd checked it before I left. I tightened my grip, and when I looked up, the fog seemed thicker, heavier, clinging to the ground. The pulse was louder now, or at least I thought so, my ears ringing in response. I backed away slowly, glancing around the dunes. There was a movement, a shadow passing just beyond the next ridge. I froze, heart hammering. It wasn't tall, not human-sized, but it wasn't any shape I could name. A trick of fog, maybe. I blinked, and it was gone. I started walking back toward the car. The pulse stayed with me, though it faded a little as the dunes opened into the road. I didn't look back. The air smelled sharper now, the wind picking up and carrying mist across the tarmac. When I got to the cab, I left the engine running. Tried calling my sister again. Nothing. I sat there for a while, feeling the pulse in my chest, like it had followed me from the dunes. Eventually, it receded into the background, absorbed by the wind and the sound of the road. I drove home carefully, headlights cutting through the mist. Everything seemed normal again. No unusual lights, no shadows moving in the periphery. The pulse didn't return. At home, I checked the dunes from my window across the road. The fog had lifted a little, and the sand was just sand. No patterns, no circles, just the faint glow of the moon on wet grass. Over the next few nights, the pulse came back once or twice, always low, always rhythmic. I never went out into the dunes again. Neighbors mentioned hearing it too, but no one had an explanation. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, I swear I can feel it under the floorboards or in the vibrations of the house when the wind comes off the sea. Not constant, just enough to remind me that something had been out there, something I couldn't name, something that had left patterns behind but no trace of itself. I tell people it was probably some strange atmospheric thing, or the wind hitting the dunes in an unusual way. Makes sense, right? But the patterns, the sand, and the way the pulse followed me, that part I can't explain. I'm careful driving past the dunes now. I glance toward the beach every night when the wind picks up. Sometimes, just for a second, I swear I can hear it. The low, steady thump moving across the sand, waiting. I'd been working at the bakery in Kirkcaldy that summer, finishing my shift late one Friday night. My friends, Ailsa, Darren, and I had been talking about heading down to the Fourth Bridge to hang out, just to kill time and watch the river at night. It was warm for early June, not a cloud in the sky, and the bridge lights made this weird glow across the water. We got there around 10, parking near the old viewpoint that looks straight down the river. I'd been there plenty of times, but something about that night felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Ailsa was messing with her phone, Darren was leaning on the railing, and I was just staring at the water when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a reflection from the bridge lights, but then I saw the lights themselves, small white dots hovering just above the water near the bridge. They weren't moving like a plane or a helicopter. They stayed in the same spot, almost like they were waiting. I nudged Darren. "Look at that!" He squinted. "Huh, weird." Elsa lifted her phone to get a better look, and that's when it got weirder. The lights blinked, all of them, once, then disappeared for a split second before reappearing slightly higher. Then a few more appeared, forming a loose line over the water. We started taking photos, joking nervously, trying to make sense of it. Ailsa pointed out that they weren't on the bridge's radar, or so she claimed, double-checking some tracking app on her phone. "Nothing showing up," she said, her voice shaky. "No helicopters, no planes." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to think it was some kind of drones or light installation, but nothing nearby could be controlling them. The air felt heavy, and there was this low hum that I hadn't noticed at first. Not loud, not annoying, just there, vibrating in the chest a little. We stayed there for maybe 15 minutes, just watching. The lights moved together suddenly, sliding horizontally across the bridge span without a sound, like they were coordinated. Then they stopped abruptly, hovering in place for a few seconds, and vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. I blinked, and they were gone. We didn't know what to do. Darren muttered about calling the police, and we agreed. Ailsa dialed the non-emergency line and explained what we'd seen. The operator was polite, but skeptical, asked for location details, and said radar showed nothing unusual in the area. I could feel my stomach nodding. If the radar didn't see them, what had we actually been looking at? We hung around another half hour just to see if they'd come back. Nothing. Eventually, we decided to leave, joking to cover the unease, though I noticed none of us really sounded convincing. The next night, we went back. I don't know why, we all kind of knew it was a terrible idea, but there was this pull, like we needed to see if it happened again. The bridge looked the same, the river calm, the city lights sparkling, and then the lights appeared again, in the exact same formation, same behavior, same blinking and hovering. I remember my throat going dry as I whispered to Elsa, "They're back." Darren tried to get a video this time, but as soon as he hit record, the lights flickered like static, like the camera itself was interfering, then reappeared a few meters higher. I glanced at the river and noticed something strange. The surface looked slightly off where the lights hovered. Ripples that seemed too regular to be random, disappearing when the lights moved. We stayed longer this time, trying to track them, but I noticed that every few seconds, the lights would twitch, not like a natural movement, more like they were aware we were watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were observing us too, just as we were studying them. Eventually, we gave up. It was late, and the hum had grown just enough to be uncomfortable. We packed up silently, the walk back to the car tense. No one spoke until we were halfway down the path. Then Ailsa muttered something about needing to forget the whole thing. I think Darren and I agreed, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to forget because I needed to understand, and I knew that wouldn't happen anytime soon. I tried looking online afterward, seeing if anyone else had reported anything over Fife those nights. A couple of vague mentions, nothing substantial. Friends and family laughed when I brought it up. I couldn't blame them. It sounded insane, but I knew what I saw. Lights moving impossibly, behaving like nothing I'd ever witnessed, with that low hum underneath. Weeks later, Darren said he drove past the bridge around midnight, just on a whim, and saw them again. He didn't call anyone. I didn't see them again, not really. But sometimes, when I'm walking home late or looking out my apartment window, I swear I see a tiny flicker over the water, hovering for a second before disappearing. It's been months. I keep thinking about the way those lights moved, how they seemed almost intelligent, and how utterly calm and silent the night around them was, despite the weird tension in the air. I don't know what they were, or if they'll ever come back, but every time I cross the fourth bridge now, I glance up at the water and wonder. I set up camp on the west shore of Loch Marie late that afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. I'd taken the old road from Aknasheen, the one that narrows to barely a single lane and snakes between thick pine forests and peat bogs. I liked the drive for its quiet, no tourists this far out, just the smell of wet heather and the occasional sheep on the shoulder. I was there mostly for the sunset. My camera bag was stuffed with lenses and tripods. I've always liked landscape photography, the kind that makes the loch look endless and the mountains taller than they really are. I set up on a little clearing just above the waterline where the grass slopes gently into the loch. The light was golden, spilling across the water, catching the pine needles in a soft glow. I took the first few shots, adjusting my tripod, moving the camera back and forth. Nothing unusual yet. A few midges swarmed around my head, but I didn't mind. The wind was calm, almost unnaturally still, which made the water mirror flat, perfect for reflections. I crouched to check my first pictures on the screen. That's when I thought I saw a flash, a quick glint at the far end of the loch. But I blinked, and it was gone. I shrugged. Maybe the sun had caught a ripple in the water, a reflection from some rock. I took another shot. Another flash, just for a fraction of a second at the same spot, though the light didn't make sense. My eyes strained, but the horizon was empty. No birds, no planes, no clouds. Just the mountains, the loch, the trees. By the time I had set up for a wider shot, the air had gotten colder. The kind of chill that sneaks into your hands and nose even when you're wearing gloves and a wool hat. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Not just the loch or the wind, but even the usual distant hum of traffic from the main road seemed gone. I raised the camera again, framing the loch, the sky streaked with pink and orange. I snapped a series of photos, each one a few seconds apart, trying to catch the last of the light. That's when I noticed it, or at least what would show up later. In every single frame, at the far edge of the loch, there was a small, triangular shape. It was faint, metallic-looking, moving impossibly fast across the water. I didn't see it with my eyes, only on the screen. At first, I thought I'd misclicked, some lens flare or motion blur artifact. I moved the camera, snapped again, same thing. The shape had shifted in position, always triangular, always moving, always beyond my ability to see it without the camera. I lowered the camera, scanning the loch with my own eyes. Nothing. No sound, no ripple, no trace of movement. My pulse picked up. I pointed the camera again, clicked, and checked the screen. There it was again, closer this time, as if it had been tracking me. I walked a little closer to the water, my boots sinking into the wet grass. The air smelled of damp pine and earth, exactly as it had before. Nothing seemed different, except for the nagging feeling that I was being watched. I glanced behind me. The trees were still, the shadows deep, but the loch, flat and silver in the dying light, was perfect. Yet I could feel it. Something had moved out there, something that shouldn't be able to hover above the water, move so fast and leave no trace. I took a few more photos, backing up slowly. That's when I noticed the faintest vibration in the ground, like a soft thrum. Not the wind, not water, just this steady pulse beneath my feet. I paused, breathing shallow, trying to convince myself it was just my heartbeat amplified by the quiet. But the vibration didn't stop, even as I took another step back. Then, over the lock, a shimmer, just a flicker, like heat waves on asphalt. The triangular shape appeared again, now faintly glowing, moving in a straight line that made no sense with the wind or the water. I swiveled my tripod, following it, but it moved faster than my eyes could track. By the time I looked up, it was gone. Nothing left. The lock was calm, the mountains shadowed, only my pulse and that faint thrum remained. I packed up quickly as the last light left the sky. The vibration underfoot stopped once I moved away from the clearing, as if it had been tied to that specific spot. I kept checking the tree line behind me, half expecting to see something, anyone, but there was only the night settling over the hills. Back at the campsite, I pulled out my camera and scrolled through the images on the LCD. Every shot from that last half hour had the shape, sometimes high above the water, sometimes barely skimming the surface. Always triangular, always moving impossibly fast. My hands shook as I zoomed in. There was no blur, no distortion, nothing to suggest it was a trick of the lens, and yet I had seen nothing with my own eyes. I checked the surrounding area, shone my flashlight over the water. Nothing. The lock was just itself. Dark, still, silent. No waves, no ripples, nothing disturbed. I even walked the shoreline, barefoot through the cold sand and pebbles. No footprints except mine, no marks in the grass, no sign that anything had been there at all. I kept the camera on my lap as I sat by the fire, watching the last smoke curl into the night. The images glimmered faintly on the screen. I tried to rationalize it. Lens artifact? Light reflection? Maybe a seagull catching the last sun? But the triangular shapes weren't random, and they didn't match anything in the environment. The lock had been empty, silent, yet my camera insisted otherwise. By the time I fell asleep in my tent, the air had grown cold enough to fog the inside of the canvas. I dreamed of the lock glowing, of triangles moving beneath the surface, silent and impossibly fast, rising and falling with no regard for physics. When I woke, the lock was calm, the sun barely cresting the mountains. I hiked back to the car, leaving no trace of my night except the photos on the SD card. The rest of the lock seemed normal, as if the shapes had been a mirage. But I've gone back twice since, camera in hand, every time hoping to catch another flicker. Nothing, not a single image, not a pulse, not a shimmer. I still don't understand it. The images exist. The lock looked empty to my eyes. And that pulse underfoot, I can't explain that either. I tell people about it, but they smile politely and nod, chalk it up to imagination or photography tricks. Maybe it was. But I know what my camera saw. And every so often, when the wind is still and the sun hits the water just right, I swear I feel the faint hum of something moving just out of sight, far across the lock, impossible to catch. I was heading home from a late shift at the university library, and Claire had insisted we take the long way along the Tay River. It was one of those early spring nights, the air still holding a bite from the Fife winds, and the river looked like black glass in the lamplight. We weren't saying much at first, just shuffling along the gravel path that hugs the riverbank, the city quiet at that hour. That's when I noticed it. A flicker in the water, like someone had dropped a candle beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a reflection from a streetlight or a passing car, but there wasn't anything nearby. No cars, no lights, not even a passing cyclist. I nudged Claire, and her eyes widened when she saw it too. "Probably a fish," she whispered. I laughed it off, but the reflection didn't behave like a fish. It wasn't moving with the current. It wasn't darting or splashing. It just shimmered, brightening and dimming like a tiny pulsing bulb. We slowed our walk, peering at the water. There were more flickers now, scattered along a stretch of the river maybe 30 or 40 meters ahead. They weren't evenly spaced, and they didn't line up with anything on the bank. I felt a little stupid standing there, trying to figure out if it was something natural or a trick of our eyes, but Claire didn't move away either. Then, I noticed the oddest part. The reflections weren't tied to anything above. No streetlights, no lampposts, no passing boats. I lifted my head to scan the skyline. The riverbank was empty, the city dark except for a few distant windows glowing yellow. There was nothing that could have caused the patterns on the water. One of the reflections moved. not across the water with the current, but as if it was observing us. I swear it shifted toward the path where we were standing, staying on the surface of the water, flickering faster now. My stomach tightened. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Claire nodded, gripping my arm. The reflections began to form shapes, small geometric patterns. Squares, diamonds, circles, fleeting as if they didn't want us to focus too long. I tried to convince myself it was just our eyes playing tricks in the dim light, but the shapes repeated, like they were deliberate. We backed a step, and the flickers followed, sliding across the surface without changing the river's flow. I felt my chest tighten, my hands clammy. I reached for my phone to get a flashlight or maybe even record something, but the screen was dead. Not low battery dead, completely unresponsive. I shook it. Nothing. The flickers didn't pause. I tried calling out to see if anyone else was nearby, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the night air. The water shimmered again, brighter, then dimmed, forming a long line stretching further upstream. I could see the surface ripple, though no wind touched it. For a moment, I thought the river itself was moving against the current. Claire tugged my sleeve. "Maybe we should go," she said. I agreed, but as we turned, the reflections shifted toward us, keeping pace. Not fast, not threateningly, but steadily, like someone had painted the light across the water with invisible brushes. Every time we looked directly at a point, it would dim or vanish, only to appear elsewhere seconds later. We reached a small wooden jetty. I wanted to get closer, maybe see if the water was disturbed, but something in the pattern made me hesitate. It wasn't random. It was too coordinated, like it had intent. The reflection directly below us pulsed rapidly, almost like a heartbeat, and for a moment I could have sworn I felt the rhythm in my chest. Then the strangest thing happened. A reflection lifted. No, rose from the surface. It didn't leave the water, not entirely. It hovered an inch above, flickering, and the other reflections followed suit, but none of them left the river entirely. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, but I saw it. My legs felt weak. Claire grabbed my arm, whispering that we should leave. I nodded. As we stepped off the jetty, the reflections seemed to hesitate, then slide back down into the water, leaving tiny, fading ripples. I turned back once, and everything looked normal. No flickers, no lights, no ripples beyond what the wind could have made. We walked quickly along the path toward the bridge, the city lights ahead feeling impossibly safe. I glanced back every few steps. The water was calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The reflections hadn't gone. They were just waiting, still somehow there in the blackness under the city lights. When we got home, I charged my phone, checked all the apps, everything normal. No missed calls, no messages. I checked the river from our apartment window. The water was dark and still, nothing out of place. The next night, we walked the same path again. The river looked ordinary, the lights above normal. Nothing flickered. But I could feel it, the sense that whatever was there hadn't left. I mentioned it to a friend who works at the university physics lab. He suggested optical effects, reflections, refraction from the city lights. But he admitted he couldn't explain the pulsing, the patterns, or the way the reflections seemed independent of anything real above the water. Weeks later, sometimes when I'm alone, I think about it. The flickers, the hovering shape above the water, the way it followed us. And I wonder if it waits for people who are out at the right time, when the city sleeps and the river is black glass, waiting for the eyes to meet the light. I still walk along the river sometimes, careful now, keeping my distance. And I still glance at the water, half expecting something to shimmer, just beyond where the lamplight reaches. I was driving back from Crieff to Dunkeld late one November evening, a stretch of road I'd taken dozens of times before. It was one of those damp, cold nights where the drizzle never really stops, and the mist hangs just above the tarmac. The A822 winds through patches of pine and open farmland, with only the occasional cottage lit up in the distance. I'd stayed too long at a friend's house, coffee and a slow dinner, so it was just after 11 when I finally left. The road was nearly empty. No cars behind me, none coming the other way. The only sound was the wipers squeaking over the windscreen and the occasional thud of rain hitting the roof harder than usual. I was listening to Radio Scotland, but the signal had started cutting in and out as soon as I left Crieff, It was just static and faint voices, so I switched it off. About halfway between Amelie and Dunkeled, the trees opened up to a stretch of moor. It's one of the darker parts of the road. No streetlights, no houses, just black hills and sky. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a car with its full beams on, maybe cresting a hill ahead, but the light didn't move the way headlights do. It was too high, too centered on the road, and far too still. I slowed down instinctively. The light was a pale white, not harsh like a spotlight, more like a frosted bulb. It wasn't blinding, but it lit up the wet road in front of its fry, making the mist glow. No shape, no structure, just a hovering circle of light, maybe the size of a small car bonnet, about 2 meters off the ground. I pulled my car down to about 30 miles an hour, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than I realized. I thought maybe it was some kind of temporary roadworks light or even a drone, but it wasn't flashing, and there was no sound. No engine, no rotor noise, just silence. The drizzle had eased off, but the mist seemed thicker around the light. As I got closer, maybe 50 meters away, it became obvious it wasn't attached to anything. No poles, no wires, nothing in the road. It hovered perfectly still, dead center of my lane. My heart started thudding because there wasn't anywhere to turn off immediately. The verges there dropped sharply into grass and stones. I flicked my headlights off and on quickly, thinking it might be a cyclist or some vehicle I couldn't see, but nothing changed. The light just stayed there. My car was idling now, crawling along at barely 15 miles an hour. The dashboard clock ticked over to 11:27. When I was about 20 meters away, the light shifted. Not like it moved forward or back, it just glided sideways, as smooth as if it were on rails. It went from dead center of the road to hovering over the opposite verge without tilting or flickering. Still no sound, no wind. My car headlights shone straight under it, and there was nothing there. Just damp grass and fog. I swerved slightly into the other lane to pass, my eyes glued to it through the passenger window. The light didn't react to my car at all. It just stayed at the verge, maybe a meter off the ground now, soft and steady. I noticed something strange as I passed. The drizzle around it seemed to stop midair, like a halo of dry mist. Outside of that circle, rain was still falling normally. I just got past it when I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was back over the road again, perfectly centered, like it had drifted back. My stomach dropped. I pressed the accelerator, climbing to 40-50 miles an hour. The trees closed in again around the road. For a few seconds, everything was normal, just wet tarmac and darkness. Then, a pale glow appeared in the sky above the tree line in my mirror. At first, I thought it was my brake lights, reflecting off fog, but the glow grew stronger, almost level with the treetops. It was the same color as before, soft white, but larger now, maybe the size of a car roof. I kept glancing between the road and the mirror. The glow didn't follow directly behind me, but seemed to pace me off to the right, above the trees, matching my speed. I wound down the window a crack, thinking maybe I'd hear rotor blades or an engine, but there was nothing. Just the hum of my own car. By the time I reached the next bend, the glow rose higher, maybe 30 meters up, then just blinked out. Not like a switch flicking, more like it faded into the mist until there was only darkness again. My stomach was still tight, my palms slick on the steering wheel. I slowed a bit after that, scanning the trees constantly. Every reflective road sign looked like another glow in the corner of my eye. The radio came back to life with faint music somewhere past Dunkeled, as if nothing had happened. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a while with the engine off, listening to the rain. My hands smelled faintly metallic from gripping the wheel. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no alerts. I even opened the map app to see if there had been a diversion or roadworks reported. Nothing. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to the same stretch in daylight. The road was wet and empty, no sign of anything unusual. No tracks, no equipment, no poles or lights. The verge where the glow had hovered was just grass and a few scattered stones. I still can't figure out what I saw. It wasn't a car, it wasn't a normal light, and it wasn't acting like any drone I've ever seen. It just hovered there, smooth and silent, as if it had been waiting in the road. Then it moved aside, rose up, and vanished. That's all I know. I I'd been training for months to do Ben Nevis in winter conditions. It wasn't anything extreme, just a personal challenge. I'd done some smaller Munros in snow, but never the big one. That March weekend, the forecast looked clear but cold, steady minus 6 degrees Celsius near the summit, light wind. I figured it was my best shot before the season turned. I set off early from the Glen Nevis Visitor Center, still dark, headlamp on. The car park had only 3 other vehicles. I saw one guy packing his gear into a big red rucksack but didn't talk to him. The lower path was iced over but manageable with spikes. My plan was straightforward. Up the mountain track, summit by midday, back down before it clouded over. By the time the sky started turning gray-blue, I was maybe halfway up. Snow crusted on the rocks, crisp underfoot, no one else in sight. I stopped near a small cairn to drink water and adjust my gloves. The air felt heavy and still, but that wasn't unusual at that altitude. Another hour and I could see the upper plateau. Visibility was good, just a few thin clouds drifting low in the glen below. It was quiet, no bird calls, no wind gusting against my hood, just the crunch of my crampons. Then I heard something faint. Not a noise exactly, more like a drop in pressure. That sensation before a storm, but sharper. I paused. My watch showed 11:47. The sunlight was muted, and like the brightness had been dialed back slightly. I told myself it was just my eyes adjusting after looking at the snow. I kept climbing. At the summit, there were only 2 other people, an older man with a beard and a younger woman, maybe his daughter. They were taking photos near the trig point. We nodded but didn't speak. I walked to the edge to look out over the glen. The view was crisp, every ridge and shadow sharp. That's when it happened. The light dimmed just slightly, and the temperature dropped hard enough that I saw my breath fog thick and fast. I zipped up my jacket. No wind, no sound, nothing moving, but a dark shape slid across the snow. It wasn't a cloud shadow. It was perfectly triangular, like a cutout. I froze. It passed over the summit in total silence. No fluttering snow, no gust of air. Just there one moment and moving the next. Slow enough to track with my eyes, but faster than a cloud. It felt like it was both above me and around me at the same time. The man and the woman stopped talking. I glanced at them. Both were staring at the ground. The shadow stretched maybe 30 meters across, sharp edge, darker than any normal shadow. My brain kept trying to fit it into something logical. Maybe a helicopter, maybe some kind of sailplane. But there was no sound, no movement of air, no object visible above us. Then it passed beyond the edge of the summit and vanished over the north face. The brightness returned like a switch had been flipped. The air was still bitterly cold, but the extra drop eased. I realized I was gripping my trekking pole so tightly my knuckles hurt. The man muttered something in Gaelic and started packing up quickly. The woman followed without looking at me. They headed down the path, boots crunching fast on the ice. I stood there alone, heart hammering, trying to see if there was anything in the sky. Nothing. Clear blue-gray, no planes, no birds. I took a photo of the snow where the shadow had crossed, but of course it was just snow in the picture. When I finally started down myself, the path felt different. The snow squeaked underfoot in a higher pitch, like walking on styrofoam. My compass needle trembled faintly when I checked it at a junction. It wasn't spinning wildly, just quivering back and forth a few degrees. I blamed the metal of the trig point, but it kept doing it for another 15 minutes as I descended. Halfway down, I caught sight of the 2 ahead of me, far lower on the track, moving quickly. I thought about shouting, but didn't. Something about the silence felt like it would swallow my voice. The rest of the descent was normal. Snow softening a little under the sun, a light breeze picking up again. By the time I reached the car park, my watch said 15:06. The man and woman's car was gone. Mine was one of only 2 left. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before turning the key, my gloves still on. I kept looking up at the summit through the windshield. Everything looked exactly as it should. Just a big mountain, snow on top, sky above. I've gone back since in different seasons. Nothing like that's happened again. But every time I reach the plateau, I find myself glancing down at the snow, waiting to see that impossible triangle slide across it, silent and sharp like it was never really there. It was a Tuesday night in late November, cold enough that my breath fogged inside the cab. I'd been driving since 5 in the evening, picking up mostly short fares around the city. Around 10:30, I got a booking from Saatchi Hall Street out toward Drumchapel. Two lads, maybe mid-20s, tipsy but polite. I dropped them off near a row of flats, then pulled back onto the M8 heading east, empty back seat, meter off. Traffic was light, just a few cars spaced far apart. Sodium lights threw that dull orange glow over the tarmac, and the sky was low and heavy, no stars. My radio was on low volume. I was thinking about stopping for tea at the 24-hour place near Charing Cross. I first noticed it near the Kingston Bridge, a glow in my peripheral vision, high above the road. At first I thought it was just the reflection of lights from a crane or one of those aircraft warning beacons, but when I glanced up through the windscreen, there was nothing like that. Just a round pale disc, maybe the size of a bus from my viewpoint, hanging silently above the motorway. Not bright like a searchlight, more like the glow of a full moon through fog. I slowed a little, half expecting it to resolve into something normal, a drone maybe, a helicopter. But there was no rotor noise, no movement, and it didn't blink or flash like aircraft lights. I passed under an overpass and lost sight of it for a moment. When I cleared the overpass, it was still there, same distance, same position relative to me, as if it was matching my speed. I kept driving. My hands felt slick on the steering wheel even though it was cold. I tried to keep my eyes on the road but kept flicking glances upward. The thing never wobbled, never changed brightness. It was just there. At the slip road for Hillington, I thought about pulling off, but a lorry merged ahead of me and I stayed on the main carriageway. The disc shifted slightly to the left, still above me, but now angled more toward the hard shoulder. It was low enough that the streetlights threw a faint shadow on its underside, like it had substance. No one on the radio said anything. I scanned for chatter from other drivers, but it was just static and the usual noise. When I hit the open stretch past Brayhead, I rolled down my window. The air was freezing. I leaned out as much as I dared at 60 miles per hour. Nothing. No wind buffeting, no hum, no rotor chop, just the normal rush of motorway air. I decided to test it. At the next junction, I swung off toward Clydebank, indicator on, slowing hard. In the mirror, I saw the disc glide smoothly, like it pivoted, then it blinked out. Not drifted away, just gone, like someone turned off a light. My heart jumped. I checked my mirrors again, nothing. Dark sky, orange lamps. I kept driving off the ramp, hands shaking slightly. At the roundabout, I went all the way around and rejoined the M8, heading back east. Half hoping to see it again, half hoping not to. Nothing. When I reached the 24-hour cafe, I pulled in, parked, and sat with the engine running. My dash cam light was blinking. I pulled the SD card right then and there, went inside, ordered tea. My hands were still trembling enough to spill some when I poured milk. Later at home, I loaded the footage onto my laptop. Clear video of the motorway, cars, streetlights, no disc, no glow, not even a hint of overexposure, just empty sky. I phoned another driver I know, Scott, who'd been on the same stretch around the same time. He said he'd seen nothing unusual. No calls to the control room about strange lights either. The next night I drove the same road again, same time. Nothing. Normal traffic, normal sky. I still drive nights sometimes. I always glance up when I'm on that part of the M8, half expecting to see that pale disc sliding along silently, keeping pace with me, waiting until I turn off before it vanishes. I was camping near Loch Ness with my friend Callum last summer when it happened. We'd been talking about doing it for years, just picking a quiet stretch off the tourist path and setting up for the night. No hotels or crowds, just the loch and the hills. We both grew up in Inverness, so the area wasn't exactly unfamiliar, but I'd never actually camped right on the water before. It was early August, warm enough that the midges were a constant nuisance, though we'd brought plenty of spray. The day had been clear, with only thin clouds hanging above the hills, and by the time the sun dipped, the water had taken on that slate gray look that makes it seem heavier than it really is. We'd pitched our little tent just back from the shoreline on a flat patch of grass. No one else was around, at least not within earshot. We made a small fire, cooked some sausages, and had a couple of beers. It was one of those nights that felt ordinary in the moment. Banter, about work, about old schoolmates, about nothing important. Around 11, the fire had burned down to embers, and we just sat staring across the water. That was when I heard it for the first time. A sound, faint but steady, coming from somewhere across the loch. At first, I thought it was a boat engine way off in the distance, but there weren't any lights on the water. It wasn't quite like an engine anyway. It was lower, almost like a big generator running underground. It didn't waver or sputter, just this smooth mechanical hum that carried across the surface of the loch. Callum stopped mid-sentence and cocked his head. "You hear that?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "What is it?" He shrugged, and we both listened. It didn't get louder or quieter. It just hung there, vibrating faintly through the air. After a few minutes, it faded. Not like something moving away, but like someone slowly turned a dial down until it wasn't there anymore. We didn't talk much about it. I think we both assumed it was some weird acoustic thing. The loch is huge, and sound bounces strangely off the hills. I tried to brush it off, but something about it bothered me. It hadn't sounded natural. We turned in not long after. The tent was small, and I lay awake for a while, listening. At one point, I thought I heard the hum again, very faint, but it was hard to tell if I was imagining it. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke sometime after 2. The fire was completely out, and the night had that heavy stillness you only get in remote places. I needed a piss, so I unzipped the tent carefully, trying not to wake Callum, and stepped outside. The air was colder than I expected. A thin mist had rolled in, clinging low over the grass and drifting lazily above the water. Everything was quiet. Even the usual rustles and distant animal noises seemed muted. I walked a few steps down toward the shore, the grass damp under my boots. That was when I noticed the light. At first, I thought it was a star reflecting off the loch, but then I realized it was moving, slow, deliberate, gliding just above the surface. A pale sphere, not bright like a torch or a lantern, but glowing softly like a frosted bulb. It moved perfectly smooth, maybe 20 feet above the water. I froze. The light was traveling parallel to the shoreline, maybe 100 meters out. What struck me immediately was its reflection. The loch was restless. Little waves lapping in the moonlight. But the reflection of the sphere wasn't disturbed at all. It floated like a perfect twin, gliding across a mirror instead of water. I crouched without thinking, as if that would make me less noticeable. My breath felt too loud in my chest. The sphere didn't flicker or wobble. It didn't make a sound. The only noise was the faint slap of water against rocks at the shore. Then the hum started again, not faint this time. Clear, low, resonant. It rolled through the air and seemed to press against my skin, not painfully, but insistently, like standing too close to a bass speaker. The sphere slowed. I can't explain why, but I felt completely exposed. Not just watched, like it knew I was there, crouched in the mist with my boots sinking into the wet ground. I glanced back at the tent. I could have woken Callum, but I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. The hum was steady, almost hypnotic, but underneath it was this prickling dread I couldn't shake. The sphere drifted a little closer to shore, maybe 50 meters out now. I realized I'd been holding my breath. Then, without warning, it dimmed. Not gradually like a fading lamp, just a sudden softening, as if someone had turned the brightness down in one motion. The reflection stayed just as sharp, unbroken, a second sphere moving on invisible tracks. And then both were gone. No fade, no drift into the mist. 1 second they were there, the next they weren't. The exact instant they vanished, the hum cut off. The silence afterward was so complete it made my ears ring. I crouched there for what felt like minutes, staring at the spot where the sphere had been, waiting for the hum to come back, but it didn't. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and walk back to the tent. My legs felt shaky. Callum was snoring inside, oblivious. I lay down next to him, eyes open, heart still hammering, and stared at the nylon ceiling until morning. When he woke, I told him about it. He laughed at first, thought I was winding him up, but when he saw I was serious, he just frowned. Said maybe it was a drone, though he admitted he'd never heard one sound like that. He asked why I didn't wake him, and I didn't know what to say. I still don't. We packed up not long after breakfast. The mist had burned off, and the loch looked ordinary again, rippling calmly under the sun. Nothing out of place. I haven't been back to that spot since. I was heading out with Midge just after work, the kind of gray, soft dusk you get in late October around Aberdeen. The weather had been a stubborn drizzle all day, but it eased off as I clipped on her lead. Our street's a short row of semis, granite frontages, a bit of garden, neat hedges people never quite manage, and the lampposts run down the pavement like a string of old pearls. I didn't need to be anywhere. Walking the dog was the only thing that really cleared my head after a day in the office. Midge was excited in the way spaniels are, nose to the ground, tail like a metronome. We headed the usual way, past Mr. Lowe's laurel hedge. He was out on his step, headscarf in hand, looking at something in the sky. I thought he was waving and raised my hand, but he didn't move. He was just staring, slow and deliberate, like he'd been caught mid-thought and couldn't find the next one. I nodded and kept walking, thinking he must have seen a plane or a kite. People watch the sky for funny reasons all the time. The first lamp went out halfway down the street. It blinked like old Christmas lights and then was gone, the pool of orange dying to a blotch of black. I glanced up. It didn't look like a bulb blown. There was no buzzing, no snapping. It just stopped. Midge kept pulling toward the pavement edge, nose working. I blamed the council for a fault and kept going. Then the next lamp shut off, another neat little blackout, and the one after that. At first, I thought someone had turned them off from a van rolling down the road, some workmen coming to do maintenance. But there were no vans, no sound apart from the small clack of my boots on the wet pavement and Midge's breathing. With each post that died, the street got thinner, like someone was slowly erasing a line on a drawing. I had that odd, mild prickle you get when your brain is trying to file something away as normal but can't. The dusk wasn't dark yet. You could still see the sky, the pale smear of evening, and houses were dim rectangles against it. My phone buzzed, just a notification, but when I took it out, the screen was dead. No messages, no battery icon, just blank. I thumbed the side like an idiot, and it flicked back to life with the usual screen. Then the clock in the corner jumped from 17:48 to 17:49, and then up another minute. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of thing that made your mouth go dry. By the time we reached the end of the road, about half the lamps were off. People were outside their doors, some in slippers, some with umbrellas, and they all had the same slack, open expression. Nobody spoke. We all seemed to be looking the same way, above the roof lines where the sky met the clouds. There was a glow, pale and wide, drifting slowly along just above the rooftops. It wasn't a single point like a drone or a plane. It was more like a sheet of light, the sort that makes snow look brighter at night, but it moved, and it moved in a way that didn't match the breeze. It was white, not the warm sodium light of the lamps, and it had this softness like a lampshade on a bedside table. When it passed over a house, the windows didn't suddenly flare or go glass bright. They stayed the same. The oddest thing was it gave off no shadows. Trees that should have cast a smear on the pavement beneath them stayed still. People's faces didn't change shade. The glow touched everything and nothing altered. I watched it, mouth open more from the effort of breathing steady than anything else. Midge stopped as well and sat down, ears pricked. Dogs do sense things we don't, and she was looking straight at the glow like she'd known it in another life. The glow hovered a pace above the roofs, and then drifted like a slow cloud along the line of houses. It moved past an upstairs window, and the curtains didn't flutter. The light simply slid over the glass as if the glass and the light didn't bother one another. As it passed, the remaining lampposts went out one by one in neat sequence. It was too ordered to be coincidence. They died like a chain, the orange pools withdrawing as if someone was scooping them up and lifting them away. It made the street feel thinner, nerfed of its normal bite. There was a hush, but not the comfortable kind. The hush that comes when an audience holds its breath and doesn't know why. The next odd thing was the sound. For the first minute, everything was still as if the world had pressed a mute button. Then, faintly, I heard a hum. It wasn't electrical, not the thin, high-tuned whine of a transformer, but a low, almost felt sound that seemed to slide through the soles of my shoes. It built in a patient way, like the background of a large machine powering up slowly inside a factory. It made my teeth feel a little loose, as if they were trying to find new positions. I expected the glow to make a landing or to stop and hang over someone's roof like a lantern. Instead, it kept drifting, and as it passed over the row, the last lamp clicked off, and we were plunged into a kind of even dusk, only lighter in the sky. The hum softened and then vanished the same way it had come, no fading, just absence. What struck me first when the street relit was the immediacy of it. The lights didn't come back one by one, they all snapped on at the same millisecond. It was an effect like someone hit play on an orchestra. The lamps returned with the same exact, dull, orangey warmth as before, like nothing had happened. My phone screen blinked and the time jumped the same way it had before, a small stutter but nothing to anchor real panic to. People closed their mouths and shuffled. Mr. Lowe waved his scarf at me like we'd never stopped talking. I laughed then, a short sound that felt more like clearing my throat than humor. It was because I couldn't place anything else. You get small, odd things when you live long enough. Sparks, phantom smells, flickers in the corner of your eye, and you learn to fold them into the life you have. I told myself that's what this was, a combination of a power cut in the wrong place and some odd weather. I told myself that until the words tasted wrong in my mouth. We walked the rest of the route slow, Midge sniffing, me keeping an eye on the skyline. Nothing else moved like that. Planes came and went higher up, cars went by with their normal snarl, and the only things that didn't fit were the way people kept glancing up and the way the lamplight had gone like a tide, neat and complete. That night I got home and made a pot of tea I didn't really want. Jess was already in, her scarf still damp from the bus. I told her the story because that's what you do with little domestic certainties. You bucket them out of yourself and set them on the table to be looked at. She listened, frowning, and asked the sensible questions. Did the lamps blink back on immediately? Were there any emergency sirens? Did the neighbors call the council? I answered as best I could. We rang the council number as she suggested. The line said no outages were recorded for our street. The BBC had nothing on the regional feed except a weather report. After that, for a few days, I walked the dog at the same time because you don't do routine change on the strength of a weird evening. Routines are what keep people from turning small things into big stories. The lamps stayed on, the sky did normal sky things. Neighbors said they'd seen it too. Some nodded and said it was strange. Others shrugged like people who have too much to do to be disturbed by oddities. Mr. Lowe offered me tea when he saw me next. He said nothing about the glow, but he had the same strange look in his eyes when he did. I haven't seen the white drift again. I check the sky more often now, which is a small price to pay. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, the memory of that even line of lamps going out comes back with a kind of clean geometry to it, neat, ordered, like an experiment. Other times, it's the way the glow didn't make shadows that lingers, that silent fact. For a short while, I wondered if I dreamed it. Then I thought of Midge sitting rigid, not barking or yelping, but fixed like someone holding their breath, and I knew it had been real enough for her nose to remember. I don't have a tidy finish to the night. Nothing landed, no voices called from the rooftops, no lights stayed that weren't lamps. Just one drifting whiteness and a row of lamps flicking out and then back on like nothing had happened. That image sits in my head now the way a pebble sits in a shoe. It's small, it's irritating, and it's impossible to ignore when you go for a long walk. I woke before my alarm because Birdie was whining at the bedroom door in that thin, urgent way he does when something's wrong out in the yard. It was the kind of cold morning that gets into the joints. Late October, sky still the color of old pewter, and the kitchen clock said 5:12. I threw on a jacket, the only pair of boots I keep by the door, and let him out. He shot past me like he'd been waiting his whole life for that moment. The yard was gray and soft with mist. Normally at that hour, I'd hear the cattle shifting in their field, low pulls and rumbles that mean the herd's comfortable. This time it was quiet, too quiet, the sort of quiet that hangs in your teeth. The only sound was Birdie's nails on the flagstones and the water dripping from the eaves. I called out, "Callum," because he's the one who usually stirs at the same time I do and grumbles about tea. No answer. I put the kettle on for myself instead because there's no point worrying the dog. Birdie nosed at the kitchen door and then became rigid. tail tucked, ears forward. He wouldn't go into the yard. That was odd. He's not a coward, but he's smart in a way that makes you listen. When I opened the back door to the field gate, I saw them. Every one of the cows lined up along the fence, backs to the paddock, faces pressed through the wire toward the sky. They were packed tight, like people at a queue, not scattered around munching as they should, and their heads were all tilted up with their mouths closed. Their eyes had that glassy, fixed look animals get when they're startled by something bigger than you can name. A couple of calves were huddled under their mothers' bellies, trembling. I stood on the gravel for a long second, trying to tell myself the sensible things. Foxes? A badger? Maybe a silent van idling on the road? None of it felt right. The mist sat lower than usual, the field itself a smudged patch between hedgerow and fence. I could hear a faint thrum, not loud, not like a machine, more a vibration in the damp air. It tugged at my chest the way the first cold does. "Hey," I said loud and useless. Birdie barked once, short. The sound didn't stretch far. The cows didn't move. They kept watching, chewing air, staring. I pulled my wool cap down and took the long way round to the gate so I didn't spook them. Because if cattle spook unexpectedly, it's trouble. As I got closer, I realized the birds were missing. The hedges that usually stuttered with sparrows and starlings were empty. No house martins flitted over the yard. Even the usual wood pigeon that nests in the sycamore wasn't calling. In a place where birds are the first clocks, it felt wrong for them to be absent, like someone had asked them to step out of the script. Near the gate, I heard a different sound. Something like a pulse, slow and patient, coming from above the field. I looked up. The mist thinned a touch, and there, hovering maybe 30 feet above the pasture, was a pale glow. It wasn't bright, you could look at it without needing to squint, but it pulsed in a steady beat, like a slow, distant lantern being ruffled by a hand. It gave off no heat that I could feel. The hairs on my arms stood up, which is always a stupidly obvious thing when you realize your body is being asked to do something before your brain has agreed. When I lifted my phone to take a picture, the screen lagged. The camera app opened with a sluggishness I don't get even with old phones. The shot looked wrong on the display, grainy where the mist should soften the image, and the glow in the sky appeared as a pale smear rather than a neat source. I snapped a couple anyway because I suppose that's what you do, the same reflex that makes you film a crash from the side of the road. The cows were silent except for the soft sound of breathing and the odd low swallow. I called to them because I wanted motion, something normal, sheepish even, to break the stare. A couple turned with that slow, patient movement cows have, heads lifting, but they still watched the glow and then took their mouths back to the air. Birdie crept up beside me and sniffed the air like he'd been given a new language and was trying to parse it. The pulse of the light slowed, then sped up, and each change seemed to press against my chest. I know that sounds theatrical, but there's a pressure in the gut you can't argue down. It wasn't a sound so much as a rhythm you felt. If I put my hand flat on my thigh, I could feel it like someone hammering a soft fist. I thought about getting the old tractor. Heads are better than phones for moving cows if you need to prod them along. The tractor was outside the shed, cold but loyal. I went to the door and the shed light came on for a second like someone had bobbed past the switch, then off again. I hesitated. The glow above the field didn't change. Birdie sat down at my feet and didn't move when I did. By then the sky had lightened a little, dawn leaking in, but the glow hadn't. It seemed indifferent to the sun coming. I noticed then that it cast nothing on the ground. There was no pool of light under it, no shadow peeking from the cow's legs, no change in the pale dew. The field was exactly as wet and normal as it had been under the neighbor's sodium lamp 2 fields away. It was as if the glowing thing and the rest of the world were in different rooms with a glass between them. For 5, maybe 7 minutes, the cows stayed pressed to the fence and the glow pulsed like a slow-breathing thing over them. I didn't move much. I tried to tell myself practical things. Maybe it was a drone, maybe some kind of sign, maybe someone messing. But nothing made sense with how the birds had gone quiet or the way the light refused to touch the grass. Then, with no fanfare, the glow stilled and then folded down in intensity until it was as faint as a star. When it disappeared altogether, The sound that had threaded under everything slackened and went silent. The field released a breath it hadn't known it was holding. The cows blinked, turned toward each other, and shuffled a few steps, sniffing and nosing and remaking the herd order. Birdie brightened and wagged like he'd been let off the leash. I breathed as if I'd been holding the breath for too long and heard, somewhere down by the yard, the tractor cough into life. The engine light on its dash came on too, except I hadn't started it. I hadn't even touched it. I walked back toward the shed with my hands in my pockets because my brain prefers to treat sudden things as if they were normal and tested. The tractor's headlights were a bright, dull yellow staring out from beneath the canvas. They were on, and they were not supposed to be. I stood there stupid for a while, thinking it must be a faulty switch or a wiring problem. But if a relay had stuck, the light would have been steady, not that sudden on like someone had flipped it at the end of the field. I checked the starter key, turned it in the empty ignition, and the engine made the right little noises, but the lights stayed on with no sign of the ignition being engaged. The battery readout on the side showed normal charge. Nothing electronics-wise made sense. Callum came out then, rubbing his eyes, asking what was wrong. He said he'd woken to the sheep bleating and the dogs being off, and then he saw the cows like I had. He and I stood looking at the tractor and then at the field and said little. There's a sort of solidarity in shared oddness. You don't dismiss it as quickly when someone else says the same words you did. We herded the cattle through slow talk and louder calls, and the old crooks we use for prodding until they moved back into the middle of the field, where grass is better and the fences are a joke to them. They took to their grazing like nothing had happened. By 7, the mist had burned off, and I was standing with a mug on the milking stool, the sun a pale coin over the hedge, and the whole place looked like ordinary life again. Dawn and dirt and cows chewing. The tractor lights stayed on until the mechanic came out an hour later and checked the electrics, shrugged, found nothing, and said the ignition looked fine. Might be a ghost, he said with the lazy grin of a man passing the worry on. We laughed, because what else do you do? We swapped sensible reasons, and then said nothing that would start the long game of telling. I don't have a clean end to this. The cows are the same cows, unbothered by my questions. Birdie sleeps at the foot of my bed like a small guardian. I tell visitors the practical things, faulty wiring a prank, and my voice wants to be sure. Part of me keeps thinking about the way the birds left, about the pulse under the air that made my teeth feel strange, about the glow that didn't touch the grass. I can explain a lot of the world with wires and weather, but that morning left a finger of doubt I can't quite nail down. I went back out the next day, looked up at the sky until my neck ached, took a few photos, checked the radio for static. Nothing came of it. For a while, I kept the tractor key on the hook rather than the ignition because small rituals feel like a bandage. Life went on. Milk to the buyer, fence posts replaced, the mare foaled exactly when she should. But sometimes, in the quiet before the kettle boils, I catch myself watching the sky and thinking of cows lined up against a fence, watching something I couldn't see with my camera and couldn't pull into any familiar box. I was on my 3rd round and thinking about tea. It was one of those fogs that come off the river and hang in the streets like someone had left curtains out overnight. Thick, low, the kind that makes the world feel smaller. My van's parcel bay was half full, the scanner still on my belt, and I'd done the usual run through the warehouses and flats down by the waterfront. Most of the city had emptied for the night. Dundee gets quiet after 11. You could hear the fog swallow sounds if you listened. The first odd thing was the radio. I always had it tuned low, a bit of speech to keep me awake. For a while it was fine, local station, some dull late-night show. Then, just as I turned onto Lockheed Road, it went to static. Not the familiar hiss you expect when a signal fades, but a thin insect kind of static that rose and fell like someone breathing near the aerial. It flickered on for a second, and then cut to a kind of mechanical silence, like someone had pressed mute on the world. The display on the head unit blinked, but showed no station. I thumbed the dial. Nothing. Then it came back, Another thin sweep of static, and then nothing again. It wasn't regular like a broken connection. It was a sort of hesitation in the air. I told myself it was the usual interference from the old buildings or the van's wiring being old. I said it out loud because saying something out loud makes it less like your mind playing tricks. That's what I told myself for the first 5 minutes. The fog made everything anonymous. Streetlights blurred into halos that didn't reach the pavement. The terraces on Tay Street had their curtains drawn like the houses were shy. People who normally stood smoking out kebab shops were absent. The city's night workers, those who keep the buses running and the bins emptied, were mostly gone, and that meant fewer stray sounds to tell you where you were. Even dogs weren't barking much. There's a small constant hum in a city at night. That hum was thinned down to a tick. The second odd thing was the way the van behaved at idle. The engine was warm and steady, but then for a heartbeat, the dashboard lights dimmed slightly, as if someone had tightened a hand on the electrics. It was quick, barely a second, and the heater fan kept turning like nothing had happened. I checked the battery gauge. It read normal. I put the van into gear, pulled up, and everything felt ordinary. It was one of those little failures you shrug at because nothing major came of it. I was out on foot for some of the deliveries. The closes are quicker that way, and I left the rear doors open to let the fog drift through the back of the van so it wouldn't hold the smell of other people's packages. The fog inside the bay made everything look soft and out of focus. I had a parcel for a first-floor flat, and when I climbed the steps, the stairwell lights dimmed as if they were being watched. The woman who answered the door had her hair in a towel and looked as if she'd expected noise and got a silence instead. She said nothing about it. People don't always say what they notice. It's easier to let odd things slide. When I got back to the van, the radio was doing the same thing again. Static. Silence. Static. I sat inside with the heater on and watched the droplets beat on the window. My scanner beeped and gave me a new code to drop off by the docks. The voice in my ear through the headset, Dave at dispatch, was clear at first. Then his words flattened and hissed, and then came back as if he'd swallowed them and then spat them out. He asked if I could take an extra parcel, and I said yes without thinking. More. Because I didn't want to be the driver who said no. The call dropped. The headset showed no signal. 10 seconds later, it was fine. I drove toward the docks, following the familiar turns. The fog seemed to hug the van tighter the closer I got to the River Tay. There was a smell I couldn't place, a faint tang, metallic and a touch sweet, like someone had left a pot of pennies to molder. It made me think of old hospitals and things people keep in jars. I told myself that was ridiculous, but the smell lingered in the cab. Near the old B-listed warehouses, the fog thinned for a second and I saw a pale light hovering over the rooftops. It was the third odd thing, and the first that felt like a thing rather than a glitch. It wasn't a street light or a lamp. It was a soft white glow, about the size of a slow-moving cloud pocket, just level with the terraced roofs. It floated without motion, not bobbing with the wind, just sitting there like a lantern hung in the wrong place. I pulled over because you pull over when you see something that isn't a thing you usually see, mostly because that gives you a chance to look without being foolish in a heap of traffic. There wasn't any traffic. The pause was brief, but the glow remained, an odd bead over the rows of houses. No sound from where it hung, no hum, no drone. There are nights when the fairy lights shine and sound can travel, but this wasn't that. The roofs below were dark, windows closed, and the glow didn't seem to touch any of the slate tiles. It simply sat in the fog, quiet and unmoving. The radio went to static again, like someone had drawn a curtain. And then the strange, small thing happened. When the glow shot upward, it did it so quickly it made my stomach go light. It shot straight up through the fog like someone had hoisted a wand from the ground. It didn't arc or leave a streak. It left a line of clearer air and then it was gone, up into the cloud layer and out of sight in a heartbeat. There was no sound at all to match that speed. No wind gust, nothing. It was as if it had entered a different room above the fog. The radio cleared. The bass line of the late-night show came back like a curtain being pulled aside. Dave's voice, full and steady, came through the headset asking where I'd parked. I answered, chest too quick, and he said he thought he'd lost me for a second because his screen showed me stopped in a place with no GPS signal. My hands were shaking, and I told myself that was nerves, nothing else. I was surprised how automatic the clearing felt. 1 second broken, the next perfectly fine, like someone had flicked a switch. I finished the last deliveries with my hands on the wheel like a man holding onto a rope. The city hummed again, that city hum that says nothing very dramatic is happening. Somewhere a pub door banged, and a bit later a taxi rolled by. I stopped for a coffee from a late-night van on the corner, and the two guys there were laughing about a football match. They hadn't seen anything in the fog, or if they had, they said nothing. You get that a lot. People choose not to mention the weird while it's happening. It's easier to compare notes later with someone who's been awake the same way you have. On the way back to base, my dash clock misbehaved. It skipped 30 seconds and then settled. My phone, which had been on 10%, showed battery as normal again. Small things went slippery. The scanner showed a missed scan that I later found in the back of the van. The route that should have taken me 15 minutes took 17. You add these up, and the number on the page is still small, but they leave a taste like pennies on the tongue. I unloaded the last crates at the depot and tried to laugh about it with Kenny, who parks next to me. He shrugged and said the fog plays games when you're tired. He's right. You get tired enough, and a lot of things start to rearrange. I told him about the pale light, and he said he'd heard a rumor of drone tests up the coast. He said it in a way that was both a story and a small hope. By the time I left the depot, the fog had cleared from the main roads into a mist that would blow away by morning. I drove home with the stereo low, the same cheeky presenter talking. I was fidgety. At the lights on my street, an old man outside his house waved at me, and I waved back. His face had that look people get when they've been waiting for someone to get home. I locked up and sat for a while in the kitchen with the kettle steaming, staring at the circle of condensation on the window where the street lamp made a faint halo. I didn't tell my partner everything. I told her the bits that sounded reasonable. A radio going off and on, odd battery readings, a bright light in the fog that shot off. She made tea and nodded, the way she does when my work is being strange. She asked if I was all right, and I said I was. The truth is, I kept thinking about how quickly the light had gone and about the silence that had held right before it. I kept thinking about the immediate clarity when the radio came back. It was the clearest thing, the one reliable detail among a night of small misbehaviors. Later, I watched back the little clip I'd taken on the dash cam. The footage showed fog, the van parked, the street, and at one frame, a pale blur rising. On replay, it skipped like bad splice work. One frame with the blur, the next frame gone. The audio track had a blot of static and then clear speech. The timestamps didn't match my watch by a few seconds. It's all the kind of proof that's easy to file away and harder to explain. I slept poorly that night, waking to the sound of rain at dawn. Outside, kids were playing, and the city was doing what cities do: scraping, sweeping, opening. The fog was remembered only in little puddles and a damp smell on the washing lines. I drove to work the next day and did my rounds, the roads bright and ordinary, people back from their holidays, buses on time. But sometimes when I'm filling the kettle and the evening is like it was, low and gray, I find myself listening for static in the radio or for a soft sound under everything. Mostly I don't hear it. Sometimes, out of habit, I glance at the rooftops. The memory sits like a small unlabeled thing you keep in a drawer, precise enough to be real and slippery enough not to be pinned down. I was walking home from the late shift when the lights at Saatchi Hall and Renfrew Street froze on red. It was one of those wet, boring Glaswegian nights, cold enough for the rain to feel like an insult, not enough for it to be proper sleet. The pubs were spilling out, the takeaway windows steamed, buses sighed at the stops. I had my hands in my pockets and my collar up, head down, thinking about nothing in particular. Dinner, whether to stop for milk, whether the tram would be on time in the morning. I reached the corner and slowed because the pedestrian crossing was empty. Usually at that hour, someone was always there. A woman with shopping, a couple arguing quietly, a guy fiddling with a cigarette. This time, there was no one. The red man glowed stubbornly against the drizzle. I looked up out of habit, and that's when I noticed the clouds. They weren't thick, just a low overcast, that dull gray that makes London Bridge men look like cutouts. But there was a metallic sheen to a patch of them right above the junction, a dull, reflected light like a sheet of brushed steel catching the headlights. It was low enough that if it'd been a plane, you'd expect a noise, a warble of engines, or at least the whoosh of wind. There was nothing. The air felt heavier, the kind of pressure that makes your teeth sound louder. The first odd thing was the sound from the tram lines. A tram had stopped a little way down the street, and the motors had gone quiet. Not the idle noise you get when one's waiting at a stop, but a complete cut. The distant rumble of the city was there. Boots on cobbles, a dog barking once, but the immediate world around the junction had this pinched silence. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I took it out, the screen showed no bars for signal. I shrugged and shoved it back. You don't assume global failures because you lose a bar in Glasgow. I waited for the light to change. It didn't. The red stayed steady. The countdown didn't begin. I leaned on the pole and watched because that's what you do when something small jars you. You look longer, hoping to catch the rational reason. The traffic on West Nile Street had thinned to occasional taxis, but the junction was clear. The red worked on 3 sides. The only thing moving was a pigeon on the traffic island, and even that bird looked nervous, half-feathered and shaking like it might lift off at the wrong second. Then, above the roofs where the city swallowed the sky, a disc hung in the cloud cover. I know how that sounds, a disc, but that's what my eyes told me. It was round, maybe 30 feet across from where I stood. Metallic in a way that didn't glitter so much as drink the light and smooth it. It held itself motionless, and because the cloud layer was low, it looked almost pressed up against the ceiling of the sky. There was no light coming from it, no strobes, no navigation beacons, just that hard, quiet surface, bright enough to be noticed in the gloom. Nobody around me screamed or pointed. People did what Glasgow people do. They glanced, paused, then looked away as if the sensible course was to ignore oddities. The pub door opened and a man in a flat cap shoved a pastry in his mouth, then blinked like he'd seen a thought. A woman with a pram stopped her push and stood stock still. The small crowd clustered under the bus shelter watched with their faces upturned, mouths shut. I felt unaccountably foolish, the way you do when an animal sees something you don't, exposed and surprised. A sound came then, or rather a lack of sound turned into a sound. It was like someone had put a hand over the world and hummed, a low, steady resonance that sat under your ribs. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of thing that your bones notice before your ears do. My phone vibrated again in my pocket, and this time when I pulled it out, the battery percentage flicked and dropped a few points in half a second. The clock stuttered. 22:11, 22:12, 22:14. I frowned and thumbed the screen, but the time had jumped and the network icons were still blank. I fished the phone out again and switched to camera because I have the reflex. We all do now. Film first, think later. The camera app opened with a slowness like a machine thinking, and when I tapped the record button, a little red dot started and a tiny counter danced. I trained it up, squared the disc in the frame, feet rooted on the wet pavement. The image on the screen was grainy from the drizzle, but there was the disc, flat and matte against the cloud like a coin stuck to a ceiling. I kept filming for maybe 20 seconds. In my head, I ran through explanations. A film crew, an advertising drone, some art installation. None of them sat right with the way the light just hung there, the way the clouds seemed to loop around it without breaking, the way it didn't produce a reflection on the wet road. If anything, the ground under it looked duller, like someone had taken the contrast out of that patch of the street. A taxi near the junction, taking it slow. I watched the driver's profile as he approached. He didn't look up. His hands gripped the wheel, jaw tight, and then he eased through the red and across the intersection, engine coughing, the whole thing a small, ordinary violation. As his rear lights glossed past, the red man on the crossing stayed lit. The traffic lights showed no sign of maintenance. I've no rapid blinking that indicates a fault. They simply stayed red as if the world had set them there on purpose. Then the disc shifted. Not theatrically, no swoops, no vertical ascents, but as if someone had lifted it a few inches and nudged it sideways by the width of a coin. The cloud above it rippled marginally, making me think of hot air over metal, except there was no heat. I felt a tightness in my chest, a nonsense worry that I was being ridiculous and that I was also going to be late for no good reason. I zoomed the camera in further. The image jittered, a strobe of the sensor, and the disc blurred. At that moment, a single car pulled up at the lights from the opposite side, the only one waiting. A young woman in a denim jacket sat behind the wheel, head resting on the steering wheel like she dozed. She looked up once and then down again. The disc paused over the intersection, and then, before a single blade of the traffic light could turn green, it was gone. It was like somebody had erased a drawing from a wall. One frame had it, the next didn't. There was no ascent, no sound of displacement, no parting of clouds. The patch of sky returned to its unremarkable gray as if nothing had ever been there. The low hum ended with a gentle taper, as if someone turned down a radio. The lights clicked through their cycle, and the red man blinked out. The young woman in the car shifted, looked around, shrugged, and drove on. I stopped recording and watched the video back on my phone. On the screen, on the little scratched rectangle of glass, the disc was there 1 second and gone the next, exactly as I'd seen. But when I scrolled the footage frame by frame, there was a glitch where the light should have been, a smear like a bad splice. I played it again and again, and the smear was a smear. It didn't resolve into any sensible thing. The time code jumped too. The file's timestamp was 30 seconds off the system clock. The phone's battery had shimmied down another 10% in a breath. People around the junction resumed their small movements, which felt like a soft exhale after a held breath. Conversation restarted, little jokes about the weather, someone asking the time. The woman with the pram pushed on, and a man in a suit checked his watch. I stood there until my knees went numb and then walked the rest of the way home because standing still felt like asking for trouble. My feet splashed through puddles, and the city noise built back up around me like an old blanket. At home, I boiled the kettle twice and made tea the way you do when your head won't stop racing. Jess was up. She asked where I'd been, and I cheated and said late at work. I wanted to show her the video, the small slab of the night where the city had done something I had no name for. But my phone, being strange, refused to play the clip smoothly. The file stuttered and showed only static where the disc had been, even though the rest of the footage was fine. I sat there with the tea going cold, my throat full of unfinished sentences. I checked the news before bed, because you do, and there was nothing. No traffic reports, no police notices, no aviation warnings. Someone had a drone incident at a festival in the borders, and that was the nearest thing. I found myself looking at the sky from the window as if it might reveal an answer in the way a sore tooth reveals where the ache is. It was just clouds, the city orange below, normal enough to be a betrayal. In the week after, friends laughed and called me a city romantic, and a few people said they'd felt the lights hang too, but had been too busy to look. The phone file never cleaned up the smear. Every time I go past that junction now, I find myself slowing, glancing up, thinking of the way the clouds held that metallic flatness and the way everything behaved like the end of a trick. I can say what I saw, and I can show you. The film, the timestamp oddities, the battery quirks, but I can't say why the traffic light held on red or what the disc was when it chose to disappear. I just know I crossed the road on green and walked home. I was out on the water before midnight because that's when it's quiet and the fish don't mind you watching. The sky was clear for once, cold and sharp, and the tide around Oban had that slow pull that makes the boat want to sit in the same place until you force it otherwise. I'd taken the 16-foot skiff because it's nimble and because I like knowing every sound it makes. I called the harbor master on the VHF to say I was heading out, and he grunted the usual, watch the buoy, mind the kelp. And I thought I'd be back before 2. At first, nothing felt out of the ordinary. The seabed contracted and rounded beneath the echo sounder in the familiar way. The chart plotter showed the usual channel markers, and the radio had that low background company you keep on those hours. Football callers from the mainland, a weather blurb, a late DJ's voice drifting soft. I set my lines and sat with my thermos and a small torch. The town's lights smudged orange along the horizon, and beyond them the outline of Mull was a dark shoulder. The first odd thing was small. The gulls. There should have been more of them. Squadrons that follow the boat when you're hauling, their white turning and wrinkling in the air. Instead, there were only a few, and they kept their distance in a way birds do when something's wrong with the wind. A gannet looped out past the headland and then veered off and vanished into the night like a hand pulling a thread. I told myself gulls do odd things sometimes, and that's how I left it for a while. The second odd thing was the sound under the hull. I could hear the water slap and the gentle keening of the engine, but there was another sound layered under them, a low, steady vibration like a far-off generator. It was there and not there, so subtle I thought at first it was something in my teeth. When you fish long enough, you learn to notice those things. I shut the engine to test it, and the boat went dead quiet except for the small creaks of the timbers, but the vibration stayed, a distant thrum under the world. That made the hairs on my arms lift, the sensible kind of alert that used to get me off rocks and into harbor during squalls. I checked the wiring and the engine, the things you check because practical checks are the best counter to unease. The battery read normal, the alternator light was off, nothing blinked on the dash. The VHF squawked for a second and then went to static, long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be alarming. When the chatter came back, it was as if someone had unmuted an adjacent room. The harbor master called to ask if I'd seen anything. I said no with a voice that sounded flat to my own ears. I moved the boat a little, cutting across the tide to a quieter patch off the reef where I sometimes drop a line jig. That's when the surface changed. It wasn't waveless in the way you get when the sea is calm. It was unnervingly flat in a small circle around the boat, like someone had smoothed the top of a pond with a board. The water beyond that patch kept its ripples and the gentle patterns of the tide as if nothing was wrong. My echo sounder showed the same depth underneath. No hollow, no suction. Just a perfect, dead smooth plate of water directly around the boat, maybe 10 meters across. The oars, when I let them hang, didn't create the usual small wake. The boat sat on a glass top. I've worked these waters long enough to know when the sea's telling me something. I felt the old, simple fear you get when a shoreline shifts suddenly in a storm. I reached for the camera and the phone because habits are strange anchors. The phone's battery icon flared oddly, full, then 3 bars, then nearly empty, then steadied again. The camera clicked, and the preview was a smear where the surface should have been sharp, the way long exposure does if the focus is wrong. I put the camera back in the case because pictures sometimes lie and you need your own eyes. When I looked up, there was a glow. It hovered low over the lock, maybe 20 feet up, and it was an oval of light, pale and steady. The kind of white that seems to hold a little bit of the sky in it. It didn't look like a torch or a flare. It had a soft edge and a presence like a lantern someone had left on a table. When I trained the torch on it, the beam slid off without catching, as if the light and my torch were doing different jobs in different rooms. It made no sound at all, and there was no heat on my face. Its reflection on the water was the thing that made my mouth go dry. Instead of a neat oval on the glassy circle, the reflection was a long, warped smear, an ill-fitting mirror image that elongated and bent as if something underneath the surface was pulling it sideways. It looked wrong in the way that makes your stomach drop. Not because it was bright, but because the physics of it didn't line up. Ripples licked the edge of the smear and did nothing to it. I watched the light and its smear for a long time, breathing thin and slow because moving felt like inviting trouble. I thought about motoring closer, about getting within throwing distance, but the engine refused to give me the same confidence. When I tried to nudge forward, the engine coughed like it had dust in it. The tachometer dipped, but then steadied. The VHF sputtered into partial life, and the harbor master's voice came through more like a question than a statement. "Are you sure you're okay?" I told him yes, even though I wasn't sure of anything. Saying yes kept me from panning out to all the places I could panic. As the oval hung over the water, it pulsed once, a soft swell of brightness that spread through the smear like a thumb rubbed across a lens. My head felt funny at that moment, Not dizzy, but thick around the brows, and I blinked without thinking. I remember the exact way the light felt on my eyes. A quick, cool pressure, and I closed them for maybe a second because the full dark behind my lids seemed like a better thought. When I opened my eyes, the oval was gone. Just gone. No trailing streak, no liftoff, no crack of sound. The smear on the water vanished with it, the surface resuming its ripple and small motions as if some invisible hand had smoothed it and then let go. The low hum that had sat under the engine and the tide dropped out of the world in the same breath. The VHF cleared. The harbor master asked if I'd lost transmission, and I said I thought so. And his voice had the small concern a man with a radio has for another man on the water. It took a long minute for me to feel the boat move under me again. I shoved the throttle forward a little, felt the prop bite, and the skiff answered like it always had. I pulled in the lines because there was no point pushing whatever it was. My hands felt cold, not from the air, but from the way my skin had tightened around my bones. When I got into Oban, there were lights on the pier, and the overnight fishermen were leaning on the rail, smoking and talking about the weather and the price of mackerel. I went and told Dougie what happened because you tell someone like Dougie who knows the coastline and will give you an honest face. He listened, spat, and said maybe I'd seen a buoy light come loose, maybe a reflection of a lighthouse, maybe nothing at all. He asked if I'd taken a photo. I told him I had, and I handed the camera to him. He clicked through the preview and his face went flat. On the camera, the oval showed as one frame of a shaky clip, a patch of white that the playback smeared with compression. The file timestamp jumped a second. There was no clear amount of time recorded for the flat patch on the water. The log in the echo sounder had a neat blank for the 10 minutes that I'd been sitting there, as if the device had decided to look the other way. The harbor master's log showed me as on the channel the whole time. Small instruments are honest in their own ways and maddening in others. I didn't sleep much that morning. I put the kettle on, tried to make sense of the order of things like a man counting sheep. The sea was ordinary through the window, moving, breathing, unimpressed. In the days after I found myself glancing at the patch of water where it had happened, checking the charts for currents and talking to Dougie and the others until they shrugged and went back to nets and engines. People have seen weirder things, they said. Maybe. Maybe not. What stays with me is unromantic and petty and stubborn. The way the water flattened around the boat like someone had put a glass plate on top of a bowl, the smear of the reflection that bent as if the water there had a different rule, and the moment of nothing when my eyes closed and the thing ceased to be. I have the photos and the log files and the harborman's half-listening report. None of it explains the physics or tells me why the echo sounder lost interest for that slice of night. I only know that I sat alone on a small boat near Oban, watching the water behave in a way I'd never seen before, and that when I blinked, the lock went back to being a lock, and I put the skiff on the trailer and went home. I was down at the field because that's what you do when the ewes start acting odd. It was just after 8 on a late September evening, the sort you get in the borders where the light leaves the hills early and the air sits without much wind. I had the dog on a lead. Jules, a black and white collie who knows the feel of these paddocks better than I do, and I was heading toward the usual gate when I heard the bleating before I saw them. Every animal in the flock had pressed itself into the near corner, bodies shoulder to shoulder, faces out toward the skyline. They weren't grazing, they were wedged against the fence like people waiting for a bus. The bleating wasn't the soft, low talk of sheep by the trough. It was high and thin, urgent. A couple of lambs were pushing under their mothers' bellies, noses working, eyes wide. I stood on the bank for a minute and tried to make sense of it. There wasn't any dog loose in the field. Jules was with me, and there were no cars on the lane, no lights from the farmyard. The hedges were still. I called the livestock because you call to make your presence known, and they kept staring at the same patch of sky, ears angled, no interest in me at all. Jules wouldn't go forward. He crouched low and whined, looking up the slope where I couldn't see anything but the first smear of cloud. He's never been a coward, He keeps the sheep in line, not frightened by much. When he tucked his tail under and back toward my boots, I felt the first honest prickle behind my neck. You learn to trust that feeling on a hill. Before the sheep turned, the day had been full of small wrong things. My old farm radio had been crackling all afternoon. Nothing new. It's a temperamental thing. But at about 6, the radio had gone to pure static for a good minute while I was fixing the gate hinge. It came back with the perfect clarity of somebody switching a channel rather than a signal fading. Then, just after 7, my watch jumped forward 60 seconds as if someone nudged it. I checked the battery, but it read fine. I put both down to old gear and late light, and the tiredness that comes from doing this work every day. As I walked to the fence, the sheep's bleats rose. They were all looking straight up, heads tilted, as if the sky had suddenly become interesting in a way it never did for them. I followed their line of sight and saw, just over the skyline of the little ridge, a dull red light. Not a flare, and not the orange one gets from a sodium street lamp. This was deeper, like the inside of a ruby, and steady rather than flickering. It hovered over the open land, level with the top of the field, and it moved so slowly I thought at first my eyes were playing tricks. It made no sound. There wasn't the mechanical whine of a light aircraft, no low hum of a helicopter, nothing. The wind was minimal, maybe a soft breath, and the light didn't bob. It slid, if you could call it sliding, in a line parallel to the hill, taking its time like someone walking and counting their steps. The pace was wrong for any plane I know. On cross-country days, you'll see planes tracing tracks between airports. You'll hear them. This thing didn't belong to those rules. I raised my hand to shield my eyes. Not because it was bright, it wasn't bright in the way that makes you squint, but because I wanted a frame. The red didn't throw a shadow or light the fence. The sheep's wool didn't catch a red hue. Their faces stayed the same, chalk and gray. The field looked normal, apart from the animals. It was as if the light and the world lived in different maps that sometimes overlapped. I took my phone out to get a photo because that's the reflex now. The screen was sluggish. The camera app opened slow, and the image came through as a smeared red blob. I tapped the shutter, and the capture took long enough that I thought the phone had frozen. When the file saved, the timestamp was off by a minute from the kitchen clock at home. Small things, but they add up when you're standing under something you can't name. Jules kept low and would not look away. Once or twice he let out a short high bark, more alarm than warning, and the ewes reacted like a wave gone through a flock, turning, pressing closer, but their focus never left the sky. A farmer's reaction is practical. I thought of the lambing shed, of straying dogs, of the rentable drones kids fly for a laugh. I told myself any of those could be the answer, that there's always a practical thing behind odd stuff. I kept looking because you see more than you tell at first. The red light moved over the roofline of the next field, slow as a hand moving across a table. For several minutes it held that leisurely pace. It didn't blink with navigation strobes, it didn't change color. It gave off no heat I could feel despite standing there in my jacket. The sound that had been under the air all afternoon, that low hum I couldn't put my finger on, seemed to slacken, then swell in time with the slope of the light's path. I'd heard that hum earlier when I fixed the gate, and when the radio cut out, it was the same tight presence now, thin and constant as a snagged note. At one point, a car drove up the lane towards us, an old van, headlights cutting white through the gloaming. The driver's face was set in that blank way you get late at night. He slowed down and looked up for a second, and then continued on without stopping. Nobody in the van shouted or pointed. People round here tend to carry the same reserve you do. They'll wait to see if the puzzle is worth the fuss. He drove off, and that was that. I walked out into the field a little, and every step the mud clung like a protest. The flock moved slightly, but stayed in a group, pressure like a tide against the fence. My boots left the same prints I always make, and the ground smelled like cow and wet straw and the tang of distant peat bogs. Yet while my feet knew where they were, my head kept trying to place the red thing under the sky. It didn't match anything I could name from years in these hills. Then the light went behind the next rise. It didn't speed up or arc. It simply slid until the little lump of ridge swallowed it. The change was immediate. The bleeding stopped as if somebody had snipped a thread. One instant, the field sounded like a market. The next, it was quiet in the way a house is when everyone's gone to bed. The sheep, who'd been frantic, immediately turned away from the fence and melted into the dark of the paddock, noses to the grass, rhythm returning to jaw and throat. Jules gave a single bark and then settled down, tail wagging the kind of slow wave you see when a dog's been reassured. My heart was doing the odd beat that makes you aware of having one. I stood for a long minute at the gate and watched the rise where the light had disappeared. There was no whoosh, no uplift sound, no flutter of bird wings in the air. The sky simply looked like sky again. The hum that had been under everything thinned, and then it was gone, the same way the radio is gone when someone cuts the broadcast. My phone screen rounded back to normal, the camera app responding with its usual quickness. The timestamp on the photo I'd taken was now the one the kitchen clock showed. I went back to the house with Jules at my heels. My hands were smudged from the gate hinge, and my boots left a track in the yard that I'd later brush aside. Inside, the kettle sang like an old friend, and my wife, Maisie, asked what I was muttering about. I told her the facts as I could. Sheep clustered, a red light. It moved slow and quiet, then it was gone. And she asked the obvious, sensible questions. Had I had anything to drink? Had I been out too long? I shrugged and made tea, because you give the sensible answers first. They're the ones that make you human again. Later, I checked the photos and the file on my phone and the camera card. One of the phone pictures had a red smear, another showed the empty rise. The timestamps were, by then, an inch apart from the kitchen clock, but then aligned if I let the devices sit for a while. You can go mad trying to make the electronics line up with your memory. I'm not going to pretend I've got a notebook of perfect proof. I don't. I've got a smear on a photo and a field of sheep that decided to press into a corner for reasons I can't stitch into a familiar pattern. I put the lambs away that night and locked the gate as I always do. The sheep were calm, chewing their cud like nothing had broken the world. I lay awake for a while listening to the house settle and thinking of the way the light had moved. Too slow for a plane, yet steady as a thing that belonged to no map I had. In the end, I told myself what I've had to tell myself before. These hills are full of small mysteries, and let that be enough for the night. In the morning, the sky was sharp and pale. The ridge looked ordinary, stubborn, as if it remembered nothing. The sheep were back to their usual scatter about the pasture, and Jules had his breakfast with the casual hunger of a dog who'd done his job. But when I walked the fence line, I kept glancing up at where the light had been, expecting the same open sky to be unremarkable and worrying all at once that something had passed over us that wasn't meant to be named. I don't have an answer. I just have the memory of the sheep's pressing and the sudden silence when the light went behind the hill, and the stubborn fact that I'm a man who does his rounds and came in at dawn to make another pot of tea. I was walking out on the moors south of Inverness late one evening in early October. It had been raining most of the day, but the clouds had broken enough to leave a low, uneven ceiling of gray. The ground was still wet, the air cold enough to fog my breath. I'd taken to walking there after work because it was quiet and there were no street lights, just open heather and low hills. That evening, I brought my small torch, but kept it off most of the time, letting my eyes adjust. There wasn't anyone else out. The nearest farm track was a mile back. I'd gone further than usual, following a faint deer path through the heather. My boots were soaked from the wet plants brushing against them. Everything smelled of earth and peat. It was almost silent except for wind sliding across the moor. It started with the heather moving, not swaying in the wind, moving like something heavy was pressing through it. I froze when I noticed it because the pattern was wrong. The plants bent in a line that ran parallel to me about 20 or 30 meters away. No visible shape, no animal. Just a strip of flattened purple and brown heather creeping forward. At first I thought it might be a deer or a dog running low, but the movement didn't match any animal I'd seen. It wasn't a single point, but a slow, deliberate shift, like a big, invisible weight pressing down. It would stop, then continue, the plants springing back up after it passed. I crouched slightly, straining my eyes. My heart was beating fast, but I didn't hear anything. No hooves, no breathing, no footfalls. Just the wind and my own pulse. Then I felt it. A faint vibration in the ground through my boots. Not like a vehicle, but more like a low, steady thrum you sense in your bones. I turned slowly, scanning the moor. That's when I realized the sound wasn't coming from the ground at all. It was above me. I tilted my head back. Against the patchy gray sky, there was a darker shape. At first I thought it was another cloud, but it stayed perfectly still while the others moved. It was roughly triangular, but the edges weren't sharp. They blurred into the sky like smoke. As I stared, the faint humming got clearer. It was low and constant, not loud, but enough that my teeth seemed to buzz slightly. I reached for my torch and hesitated. Part of me didn't want to do anything to draw attention, but the darker shape wasn't moving, and the heather in front of me was still shifting as if something was making its way along the ground. I flicked the torch on and aimed it upward. Nothing. Where I had just seen the dark outline, there's only the uneven gray of clouds. The humming cut out completely. I swung the beam back and forth. Nothing unusual, just sky. When I lowered the torch, the heather was still again. No movement. The strip that had been flattened was springing back upright. My ears rang in the sudden quiet. I turned in a slow circle. I was alone on the moor. No dark shape above, no invisible path in the plants, just wind. But my stomach was tight and my palms were sweating inside my gloves. I started walking back the way I'd come, keeping the torch on now, its beam jittering on the wet ground. Every few steps I looked up, half expecting to see the dark outline again. The humming didn't return, but twice I thought I felt that faint vibration underfoot, so subtle I couldn't tell if it was real or my imagination. The path seemed longer going back. The heather looked different, like the colors had dulled. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the strip where the plants had moved. Nothing there but empty moor. By the time I reached the fence line near the road, the sky had opened up and a light drizzle started. Cars hissed past in the distance on the A9, and the normal sounds were weirdly comforting. I leaned on the fence for a minute, scanning the hills. There was no sign of anything. No triangle in the sky. No pressed down heather. Just mist rolling in from the north, and the wind flattening the grass in random swirls. When I got back to my car, the inside felt warm and small, like a shelter. I sat there with the engine off for a while, listening. Everything was normal again, just rain ticking on the roof and the occasional car on the road. Later that night, lying in bed, I tried to tell myself it had been an animal and a low cloud. Maybe my eyes playing tricks in the dim light. But the memory that stuck was that feeling before I turned the torch on. The hum vibrating in my chest, and the heather parting like something walking that I couldn't see. I haven't walked that far out on the moor since. When I do go, I keep closer to the road and stay on the more open tracks. Even then, if the wind drops and things go very quiet, I catch myself scanning the sky. I was crossing the 4th Road Bridge just after midnight because the A90 was quiet, and I wanted to be in Fife before the pubs let out. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle that made the road look like a ribbon of oil under the streetlights. My name's Duncan, and I drive for a living, so bridges are ordinary things. Long, practical spans that get you from A to B. But that night, the bridge felt like a corridor between two different rooms. The first odd thing was that there were almost no cars. I hadn't expected traffic at that hour, but I had expected the occasional lorry or a taxi, something to break the concrete rhythm. The lanes were empty enough that I eased into the middle lane and kept the cruise on, more so I could look around without fussing with my foot. The bridge's span lights hummed along, but the usual background roar you get from a steady stream of tires was missing. Even the wind seemed polite, just a steady shove against the side of the van, rather than the usual gusts that try to wrestle you on higher decks. The radio had been playing some dull late-night show. I like voices on the air when I'm tired. And then it softened into a thin, high static that came and went like someone breathing on the antenna. I twisted the knob and it cleared for a second. A snippet of speech about roadworks somewhere near Dundee, and then back to that thin hiss. Phones showed patchy signal earlier in the day. I blamed the carrier at first and didn't worry. Then the little satellite icon on my sat-nav blinked and froze for a heartbeat, recalculated, and offered me my position 100 meters off where I was. My wristwatch, a cheap analog thing I never trust but like for the look of it, had skipped a minute when I glanced down to check the time. Small things, not enough to make a man stop, but enough to slow his breath. I kept the wipers at a steady pace and told myself the bridge had a different mood at night. The sea below was a black strip with the Kincardine lights like a shallow constellation on the horizon. There were no ferries crossing, no other vessels that I could see, just the usual distant glow of the coastline. About halfway across, I noticed something moving level with the van, outside my passenger window. At first, I thought it was a reflection. Bridge lights, the smear of my own headlight, but it didn't line up with anything. It was an orb, pale and soft, hovering like it had been hung on an invisible thread. It kept pace with me, exactly the same speed as the van, floating maybe 5 meters out from the railing and at roughly the same height as the top of the cab. It didn't bob in the wind. It didn't flicker. It had a very steady glow, like someone holding a hand lamp behind a sheet of vellum. The second odd thing came in the way I noticed the car behind me wasn't there. There was no sound in the lane beside me, no headlight tail, no scanner whisper of other traffic. I blinked and looked to the rear view. The motorway stretched empty into the dark. The orb drifted along, steady as a metronome. I'd seen drones before, lads with cameras testing them over the river, but this wasn't a drone. It had no blinking LEDs, no visible rotors, no staccato noise. It made no sound at all. My hands tightened on the wheel, that small, cautious grip drivers use when something unexpected is in their periphery. I slowed a touch to see if it would move relative to the van, thinking probably stupidly that I could outpace it for a look. It matched me exactly, closing and opening with the van's pace like someone had set it to shadow mode. I flicked the dipped beam to fog and back just to get the light to play over the glass and see if there was any physical hull to it. Nothing changed. The orb was a pale, even disk of light, indifferent to the best of my automotive fiddling. I wanted to film it, the modern reflex, but I didn't want to fumble with my phone at that speed on the bridge. I tried to steady my breathing instead, the old trick I used on long hauls when my eyes wanted to close. The hum of the bridge lights grew a little louder in my ears, or maybe that was the blood in my temples. In the passenger seat, my thermos rattled when I braked for a slowing lane, a small domestic sound that undercut the strangeness like someone had put a kettle on in the middle of a church service. There was a scent then, faint and metallic, nothing like petrol. The sort of smell you get when you're in a workshop with old batteries left on a shelf, a copper tang that made the back of my throat feel raw. It wasn't strong enough to make me cough, just present, like someone had opened a window to another room and a scrap of that room had drifted across. I checked the vents, half expecting the van's heater to be doing something, but the fan read steady. The radio tried to speak over the static and then cut clean to silence. When I glanced down at the dash, the digital clock was where it always is. I can be crap with time when I'm tired, but I noticed because the heater clicks and the sat-nav chimes have a rhythm I'm used to. The clock read note 17. I looked up, watching the orb slide with me, and then the instant the glow went out, the clock jumped to 20. There was no fade in the light. One moment the orb was there, soft and steady, and the next it was gone. Gone with no acceleration, no noise, no streak of departure. Just a small rectangle of ordinary sky where a pale circle had been. The bridge didn't sound different, but my ears were ringing with the possibility of what might have been. The dashboard's jump happened the same time. My watch hadn't moved, but the van's internal clock had leapt forward 3 minutes like someone had nudged it. My sat-nav recalculated and placed me in the same lane, no suggestion of any gap. I didn't brake. You don't on a bridge if you can avoid it. I kept going because stopping there felt like asking for trouble. My hands were damp on the wheel. The van's engine reading stayed steady. The wipers cut the drizzle in a rhythm I could trust. There were no cars behind. There were no other lights alongside. The traffic cameras later showed an empty road divided only by my own white van as it crossed, time-stamped 020, the same as the dash. After the bridge, the road opened into the town and the ordinary world stitched back together. A petrol forecourt with its buzzing canopy light, a bus shelter with a guy asleep, a cat that darted across the curb like it had somewhere very important to be. I pulled into my driveway like I always do and sat for a few minutes with the engine warming and the keys cold in my hand. The kettle at home would be on until the whistle, the bedroom light left on like an invitation. I felt the small absurd urge to check every clock in the house, as if I could force time back into agreement. Inside, everything had its usual rhythms. The hall clock ticked quietly, the microwave gave its usual beep when I reheated a ready meal, and the TV was set to a channel I knew for late-night highlights. My partner, Roisin, was awake and smiled when I walked in like I always do, tired and relieved. I wanted to tell her what I'd seen in those precise, small sentences that make things digestible, but the words felt clunky, like someone asking you to describe a feeling by naming colors. "Traffic quiet," I said instead, and she nodded, then asked if I'd had anything to eat. I made tea and watched the steam draw lazy circles up the kitchen window. The van's clock, taking a 3-minute leap, sat stubborn and small in my head. I checked my phone. The photo I'd thought to take was just a blurred smear where the orb had been. A smear that the phone's software had tried to interpret and failed. The file's metadata showed it was snapped at 0017, but the phone's system time matched the dash, 20. Little disagreements like that gnawed at me. Over the next day, I told a couple of people at work, and they smiled and said things you say to each other when you want the conversation to move on. Tired eyes, odd light, fog on the estuary. I found myself watching the bridge on the evening news as if it were going to offer a replay. Nothing turned up. The footage I pulled from the dash cam when I got the van in for its routine the next week showed a white van, drizzle on the lens, and then a patch where the light had been that the video skipped over like bad editing. The timestamp on the camera file matched the dash. The bridge cameras, the council told me when I called as a matter of curiosity, had shown nothing untoward. I don't have a picture that proves anything beyond a small smear on a phone and a skip on a dash cam. I don't have a noise that you could pin down and say that's what happened. What I have is the memory of an orb that kept pace with my van as if it had been driving with me, the impression of a clean cutout in the sky when it vanished, and a dashboard clock that refused to agree with itself for 3 minutes. People go through their days with small anomalies, and the world stitches them in 100 unbothered ways. I made tea, I checked the locks, I did my laundry. A week later, I drove back across the Forth and felt the same bridge under the tires and the same drizzle on the paint. Only this time when I glanced to the side, there was nothing at all. Just empty air and the distant blink of the oil rigs being themselves. The clock on the dashboard behaved like a model citizen. I parked in the same drive and walked into the same kitchen where Roisin made a joke about me being late. Some nights I still wake up and think I can hear a soft, steady glow where nothing is, like the feeling the bridge left of being somewhere you shouldn't have been. The sensible part of my brain tells me it was fatigue, or reflections on wet glass, or an electronics hiccup that made clocks lie. The other part, the part that keeps a list of small impossible things, remembers the 3 minutes and the way the light matched my speed and then stopped existing the second I blinked. I don't know what to do with it. So I make tea and fold the clean shirts and call it a night. I was driving through the Cairngorms late one night when it happened. I'd been visiting my sister in Aberdeen for the weekend, and instead of taking the long way around through Dundee and Perth like I usually do, I decided to cut across the park on the AA939. It's a beautiful road in the daytime, winding through valleys and climbing into the hills, but at night it's something else entirely. No streetlights, no towns for miles, just the headlights of your own car cutting a narrow tunnel through blackness. It was early March, and there'd been a light snow earlier that afternoon. By the time I set out, the roads were clear enough, but the air was still sharp, and patches of frost glittered whenever my beams caught the tarmac at the right angle. I wasn't in a rush. I had music playing low, just to break up the silence. After Tom and Toole, the road narrows and climbs steadily. The trees thin out, replaced by stretches of moorland with dark ridges in the distance. I hadn't passed another car in at least half an hour. Somewhere past Bridge of Brown, I noticed my headlights dim slightly. At first, I thought it was my eyes adjusting, or maybe I'd leaned on the dial without noticing. I reached down to check, but the brightness control was where it always was. A minute later, they dimmed again. Not a flicker, more like someone slowly sliding a dimmer switch down a notch. The engine was still running perfectly, no stutter, no warning lights on the dash. I turned the music off and listened. Nothing unusual. The tires hummed steadily on the road, then they dimmed again. By now, I was gripping the wheel too tightly. My gut told me it wasn't the car. It was something else. The beams didn't go completely dark, but they were pale, washed out as if the power feeding them was being drained. I slowed to about 30 and scanned the hillsides. That was when I saw the lights. Above the tree line to my left, maybe half a mile off, 3 faint orange points hung in the sky. They weren't stars. The night was clear, and I could see Orion high above, sharp and steady. These were lower, duller, but arranged in a perfect triangle. They didn't move. They just hovered, evenly spaced like they were painted onto the night. I kept glancing between the road and those lights, trying to make sense of it. They weren't flares. They weren't aircraft. They weren't anything I could put a name to. The strange part was how they seemed fixed, not only in position, but in brightness. My eyes should have played tricks, adjusted, shifted, but they stayed exactly the same, as if the distance didn't matter. I pulled into a passing place and stopped the car. I left the engine running. The headlights looked weaker than they should have, but they were still throwing a beam on the frost ahead. I switched them off. The night rushed in, heavy and absolute. The orange triangle stood out even more without the glare. The engine idled steady. No dip in the revs, no roughness, just the low murmur of it echoing off the banks. And then I noticed the silence outside. No wind through the grass, no trickle from the burns that usually cut across those hillsides. Just stillness, pressing in against the windows. I cracked the door and stepped out. The cold hit immediately, sharp enough to bite through my jacket. The crunch of gravel under my boots sounded too loud. The lights were still there, still perfect. I stared for what must have been a full minute, waiting for them to shift or fade or resolve into something ordinary. They didn't. Then, without any warning, they blinked out. Not one by one, gone all at once. The darkness that replaced them felt heavier, like the whole valley had exhaled. I turned back toward the car, suddenly desperate not to be standing out in the open. When I climbed in, the headlights came back at full brightness the moment I flicked them on, as if nothing had ever been wrong. I sat there gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. I thought about calling someone, but who was I going to phone at midnight on a freezing back road in the Cairngorms? What would I even say? I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. Didn't see another car, didn't see anything else unusual. But the whole drive, I kept glancing at the tree lines, at the ridges silhouetted against the sky, half expecting to see those 3 lights hanging there again. They never came back. I woke up in the middle of the night at Loch Lomond for no good reason. Normally when I camp, I sleep straight through until the birds kick off at dawn, but that night I came out of sleep like someone had shaken me. I lay there with my eyes open, waiting to figure out what had woken me, and it took a good 30 seconds before I realized what was wrong. It was quiet. Completely quiet. Usually when I camp out in Scotland, even in colder months, there's always some noise. The buzz of midges, the click of beetles in the grass, the odd bat making that faint scrape of wings, if you're tuned into it. Sometimes you'll hear an owl, or at least the constant ripple of the loch if you're pitched close enough. That night, nothing, not even the usual rustle of leaves. The silence pressed in like I had earplugs in, but I knew I didn't. I lay there for maybe a full minute, barely breathing, and finally convinced myself I'd imagined it. I thought maybe I'd just woken during a lull. But then I noticed a faint color bleeding into the canvas of the tent. It wasn't moonlight. The moon had set hours before. I'd checked my phone earlier in the night before shutting it off, and it wasn't the orange or yellow of a torch beam. This was pale green, not a vivid laser pointer green, but soft like light through bottle glass. It spread across the tent wall in a shifting pattern like it was moving over the trees outside. At first, I thought a car must have pulled into the lay-by near the trailhead. Maybe someone parking up late and their headlights hitting the canopy at a weird angle. But the glow wasn't steady like headlights. It moved in smooth arcs, like it was scanning the treetops, sliding over the branches with an eerie kind of patience. I propped myself up on my elbows, heart hammering, and stared at the ceiling of the tent. The glow passed slowly across, like something outside was searching with a giant lamp. I didn't hear footsteps, no voices, no engine, just that dead silence and the shifting green light. I reached for the zip of the flap, then stopped, holding my breath. I don't know why. I felt this deep, primal urge not to make noise, not to move too quickly. My fingers rested on the zip pull and I froze. The glow lingered on the treetops just beyond my tent, and then it drifted away, sliding across the forest as if it had lost interest. I counted in my head to 30 before I dared move. When I finally unzipped the flap and leaned out, the glow was gone. Just darkness. The tree line across the loch was a faint silhouette, and the water barely moved. It was so still it looked frozen. The silence continued for a long time, long enough that I started to get scared in a different way, because even if the glow had been someone with a torch or a strange reflection, that didn't explain why every insect in the woods had stopped. The longer it stayed quiet, the more it felt unnatural. I remember deliberately coughing just to hear a noise, and the sound of my own throat was shockingly loud. Eventually, faintly, I started to hear water lapping against the bank again. Then, after what felt like ages, a single insect started up, a faint whine like a mosquito, then another. Within a couple of minutes, the night sounded normal again, as though someone had pressed resume on the world. I sat up in the tent for hours, just listening. Every time a branch creaked or an owl hooted in the distance, I jumped. I kept watching the treetops through the mesh of the flap, waiting for that pale green glow to come back. It never did. In the morning, everything looked ordinary. Birds were loud. The air had that damp smell of moss and pine. I walked down to the water's edge with my kettle to fill it, and I stared at the tree line across the loch where the glow had drifted. Nothing unusual, just trees and mist. But that silence and the way the glow had moved like it was searching, I've never had another night like that camping. I didn't cut my trip short, but I couldn't shake the feeling I'd been watched, or worse, examined. When I packed up to leave 2 days later, I glanced back at the clearing before heading down the trail, and for just a moment, I swear the forest looked too still again, like it was holding its breath. I was out before dawn because that's how you do it when the weather says it might be worth a day. The forecast had been vague, gray with a chance of clearing, but the sea looked flat from the shore, a sheet of dull pewter that promised the small shoals would be visible once the light came. I'd been fishing these waters my whole life, and the bit of coast north of St. Andrews was one of those places you thought you knew. That morning, it felt like I was the only person who'd been left awake. I puttered the little Boston whaler past the rocks at the edge of the bay, keeping low to avoid the bird scatters in the kelp beds. The tide was out enough that my usual markers, the big, jagged boulder, the rusted post, were all half exposed, the waterline kissing their undersides. It was the sort of morning where small things stood out, the pattern of wind on water, a shoal of sprats rising, the way the gulls squawked and settled in different numbers. When I say small things, I mean the things that tell you whether a day will be good or not. Around 7, when the light was a flat gray, I noticed the birds. Not just fewer, but wrong. There were pockets where the surface should have been full of motion, and there was nothing. No dabble of white, no flare. The gulls were on the cliffs, not on the water. A tern passed low and then banked away as if something had startled it. I didn't feel like moving closer yet. I sat with the engine idling and had another look through the binoculars. The first odd thing I saw was on the horizon, just off the line where sea met sky. From that distance, it could have been anything, a fishing boat tied up at anchor, a marker buoy, but the shape was too smooth and too bright. It was silver in tone, like the inside of a foil packet. It hovered, not bobbing with the swell, but steady, as if someone had nailed it to the sky. The light didn't hit it like a reflection, it seemed to glow from its own surface. I eased closer, not because I was brave, but because that's what you do. Closer gives answers. The closer I got, the more other little things added up wrong. The air felt cleaner, like someone had turned a window in the engine room. My radio kept filling with static even though there wasn't a storm in sight. The static wasn't loud, it was a thin hiss that rose and fell with the boat's speed, like something tuned to frequency that shouldn't be there. When I turned the radio off, the hiss stopped. Then a second later, a faint, low sound threaded under everything, more felt than heard, like a distant harbor engine idling and not quite in time. I had the binoculars up when I realized the object's reflection was missing. That's the word for it. Missing. The water around it showed the usual ripple and glimmer, but where you'd expect the silver shape's twin on the surface, there was nothing. I watched the waves slap at that place, and the surface broke as if it knew there was nothing to reflect. It made no sense. Even buoyant stuff makes a shadow and a double in the sea. The ripples would catch it, but the water acted like the light never reached it. I slowed until the motor was just a soft purr. I could see the object now as a loose, silent oval, maybe the size of a small trawler, but without any hull or mast, just a shape suspended a few meters above the waves. No wake, no heat shimmer, no birds circling it. It was motionless like a buoy, but suspended above the surface in flat air that smelled of salt and nothing else. The binoculars made it fringe and close. I could see lines on its skin, but no bolts or seams, a continuous sheen, dull, like tarnished chrome. I thought about turning back then. I don't like things without names, and this was a thing without a name. I thought of home, the kettle on the stove, Maggie asleep with the radio. Then I thought, sod it. I'm a curious man. I brought the boat in nearer until the bow pointed toward it, and I left the engine in neutral so I'd drift. That's when the tide did something I'd never seen. The water that had been sitting low around the rocks started to move inward in a way that didn't match the swell. It wasn't a wave so much as a pulling, a broad shoulder of water that came in fast, faster than the charts said it should. The kelp beds that had been waving lazily were suddenly knitting together, then stretching as if someone had gathered the sea by the hem and dragged it. The rocks I'd measured for years went under so quick the whole boat shuddered and brushed against a patch I'd always kept clear. It was fast enough to make me curse and throw the engine into gear to keep a little movement, but I didn't want to rope the boat around anything. My hands were slick, my heart was up around my throat. The surge wasn't the usual trick of the channel or a gust. It felt deliberate. And while the sea moved inward, the silver thing stayed where it had been, calm, detached, like a ceiling lamp over a kitchen sink. I'd been in storms that made fine men pray, and I know how water remembers the moon, but this had none of that rule set. The tide rose along the whole little bay, neat as if someone had flipped a basin. The gulls took to the wind in a long, trying flight, their calls sharp and staccato. The radio crackled back to life when I'd flicked it on for a second. No voice, just the thin hiss again, and the low sound under the engine hummed in my teeth. I put the binoculars up once more. The silver thing was the same, but the lack of reflection sat in my head like a missing brick. I scanned the surface around it, expecting to see some distortion, a slick of oil, but nothing. The water looked right apart from the lack of twin. When I lowered the binoculars, I felt the air shift like a draught in a closed room. The sound under the engine vanished at that same moment, and the whir of my motor seemed brash and intrusive. Then, in the next breath, the silver shape dimmed, not like switching off, but shading down, as if someone had folded a curtain over it. The field of light around it softened into the normal gray of the sea and sky. You know when the sun goes behind thin cloud and everything turns polite? It was like that. And the second it softened, the tide stilled, as if someone had set a hand on the water's back and told it to stay. The quiet that descended wasn't the calm of a day ending, it was hollow. The low hum never came back. The only noise was the slap of little waves against the hull. And even that sounded wrong, too crisp. I didn't see it vanish. One blink and the object wasn't there anymore. There was no skid of motion, no upward streak. One blink, and my binocular field showed only the regular dull horizon and a band of white where waves broke further out. I found myself laughing once, a short, sharp laugh that came out of me without control. It felt like the sort of laugh you make when you've let fear uncork and don't know what to do with it. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe a reflection from something farther off, a hallucination from a long night and little sleep. Maybe the radio static and the tide were unrelated. Maybe. I didn't stay to prove any of those maybes. I tightened the engine and kept a hand on the wheel until the little bay was behind me. The houses along the seafront were empty and dark when I came in, the net drying racks stacked like ribs. Maggie was on the table with a pot of tea boiling over and a bowl for my boots. She looked up and said my name like she'd expected me to come in messy. She always did, the way wives know the shape of their men. I tried to speak normal, but my words kept catching. At home, I scrubbed salt off my face and the back of my neck, put the kettle on, and tried to make sense of the morning in my head between sips. I told her about the birds, about the sound, about the shape. She listened and asked the sensible questions. Did I see any markings, any heat, any craft? I answered as best I could. She asked if I'd gone too close. I said I'd kept a distance. I said I'd never seen a tide move like that in my life. By noon, the light had changed. The sea looked like a different thing. Blue and willing, people out on the promenade with dogs. Someone was walking the line where the water had rushed in, picking up shells and laughing because the morning had been chilly but clear. The bay looked ordinary in that way that worries me most. The world goes on, steady, with or without an answer. I told the harbor master when he came by that afternoon because that's what you do. You tell a man who keeps a book. He nodded and scratched at his beard, asked me to note the time. He said he'd heard nothing on the VHF. He said he'd had calls about a strange fog bank 2 miles out the week before, which had been gone by noon. He said a lot of things like men who are used to things that aren't right do, understandable, plausible, and then nothing that closed the circle. That night I slept badly and woke at odd hours, listening for a hum I never heard again. For a week, I found myself looking at the bay from the window when it should have been my mind on other things. I kept the binoculars on their hook by the door for longer than I should have. Sometimes the gulls would hang in a way that made my skin prickle, but the sea stayed steady. I don't have a tidy end to this tale. The silver thing didn't come back. The tide never surged that way again. I still can't explain why the surface where it hung didn't reflect it, why the water moved like hands had grabbed it, why the radio hissed at the moment I drew near and stopped the moment it dimmed. I can tell you only what I saw and how the morning pressed at me after. The rest sits there, a blank, easy to look past when the kettle's on and Maggie's humming in the kitchen, but as neat and stubborn as a bruise when the light hits just right and the sea looks like pewter again. I'd been caught in worse weather before, but that night near Fort William I made the mistake of thinking the forecast was exaggerating. The rain came earlier than predicted, and by the time I realized how bad it was going to get, I was already halfway up the trail with no proper shelter nearby. It was late autumn, around 6 in the evening when I set out, and dark by the time the storm rolled in. I'd planned only a short hike, something to clear my head after a long week, but the clouds moved quick. By the time I started looking for cover, the wind was howling through the valley, and sheets of rain were driving sideways across the ridge. I found a ledge halfway down a slope where the rock jutted out far enough that I could crouch beneath it. Not comfortable, but it kept most of the rain off. My rucksack was soaked through, my waterproofs only half doing their job. I figured I'd wait until the worst of it passed before heading back down. Lightning started not long after, first in the distance, then cracking almost overhead. Each flash lit up the valley for a split second, throwing the hills into sharp relief. I was facing east, looking across toward the darker outline of the next ridge, when one of the bolts lit up something that didn't make sense. It wasn't the hill itself, it was above it. For just that blink of white light, I saw a shape hanging there, massive and angular, cutting across the sky in a way that looked too straight to be natural. I blinked, telling myself it was a trick of the eye, some weird reflection, but the next flash lit it again. Same outline, same position. I pressed myself closer to the rock, rain dripping from my hood, heart hammering in my chest. Every time the lightning came, there it was. Not glowing, not moving, just revealed by the split-second burst of light. Edges sharp against the clouds, like part of a building had been set down in the air above the valley. I counted the seconds between flashes, gripping my torch even though I didn't dare turn it on. 1, 2, 3, and then the valley was lit again, and that shape loomed there, impossible in size. My mouth had gone completely dry. At one point, the lightning came in rapid bursts, and I saw more detail. Lines running along it, angles too precise to be a cloud formation, too solid to be anything drifting. It wasn't like a plane. It looked still, rooted almost, but in the air. When the thunder cracked overhead, I had the insane thought that the sound wasn't just thunder, that there was something under it. A low hum buried in the noise, faint but steady. I couldn't be sure. I told myself it was just the way sound echoed through the valley, but I pressed my hands over my ears and still thought I could feel it in my chest. The rain carried on for over an hour. Every time the sky lit up, that thing was there, never moving, never changing, just waiting. I shifted positions so many times trying to convince myself I was seeing rocks or mist or some trick of perspective. But no matter how I angled myself, when the lightning came, the outline was too clean. Then, as suddenly as it began, the storm started to pass. The lightning drifted further east, the thunder came later after each flash. The rain softened, then stopped. The wind dropped to almost nothing. The valley was swallowed by dark again. No bursts of light to reveal anything. I stayed crouched there, too afraid to step out. I held my torch, finger resting on the switch, but something in me refused to turn it on. The silence was worse than the storm. No rain, no thunder, just the drip of water from the rocks and my own ragged breathing. Finally, after what must have been half an hour of that stillness, I forced myself up. My knees were stiff, my back ached from being pressed against the stone. I pulled my compass from the pocket of my jacket. I always carry one, and I needed to get my bearings before heading down. The needle didn't move. At first I thought it was stuck, maybe jammed from being banged around in my pack. I shook it gently, tapped it against my hand. Nothing. The needle pointed west and stayed there. I turned in a slow circle. It didn't shift. I crouched again, using the dim glow of my head torch to check properly. The housing wasn't cracked, the liquid inside was clear. It looked fine, except the needle was frozen like it had forgotten where north was. A deep unease settled in my stomach. I shoved it back in my pocket and started down the slope, following the path by memory. My boots slipped on the wet stone, and more than once I had to catch myself on the heather. Every shadow felt wrong. Every shape of rock on the hillside made me think of that massive outline in the sky. Halfway down, I stopped and turned, just once. The valley behind me was completely dark. No movement, no sound, just the faint outlines of the ridges against the clouded night. I stared for a long time, waiting for another flash of lightning, even though the storm was gone. Nothing came. I made it back to the car park, soaked and trembling. My watch said it was past 2 in the morning, 2 May, though I couldn't account for how long I'd actually been up there. When I pulled the compass out again under the beam of the car's interior light, the needle was moving, but sluggish, like it was dragging itself back into place. After a few seconds, it pointed north again, steady as if nothing had happened. I left it on the passenger seat for the whole drive home, glancing at it every few minutes. It never wavered again,